Hey, YouTube. Welcome to Gas Masks and Hand Grenades. I'm your host, Metal Madness Jeff, and today I'm joined by a man who has nearly 40 years notched on his belt in the music industry as a singer, composer, entrepreneur as well. He is most well known as the vocal half of the English art experimental dream pop post-rock band No Man. See how many genres I can cram in there on the No Man nomenclature there. Although I want to note that he is very involved in the music side of writing as well. He's not just a vocalist. He's also released 7 solo albums and has been in numerous collaborations with artists such as Richard Barbieri, Pete Chilvers, Giancarlo Era, No Sound, which is Giancarlo's project, Central Zune, Judy Dibble, OSI, and Darkroom, and probably several in there that I've missed. But if I keep doing that, we'll be going on all day here. He was also one of the very early pioneers in the internet distro label combos for progressive, experimental, and classic rock genres with Burning Shed, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about that. In addition, he now has a podcast with his No Man partner, Stephen Wilson, who you guys have heard me talk a lot about, called The Album Years, where they wax poetic about their favorite albums from various genres from years past. Please welcome Tim Bowness. How are you, Tim?
Hello, I'm all right, thank you.
Great to see you. We did talk a little bit backstage. You sound great. Everything's good to go. So I want to thank you for joining me. And we kind of got this interview together as a result of a deep dive that I did on my channel about 3 months ago in the No Man catalog with my good friends Serge and Doug. And really, I got to say, it's quite a thrill to finally speak to you after being a fan of you and obviously Steven with No Man, but of you for probably nearly close to 25 years. I keep trying to think, did I get into No Man in 99 or 2000? I'm not entirely sure. I'm getting old and I can't remember the exact entry point. I do remember the exact entry point as far as the album that I got, and that was Returning Jesus. So it might have been around 2001, but I was aware of you obviously through the fact that I knew Steven quite well through Porcupine Tree. So
yeah.
So let's take a few steps back and let's go back to when Tim was a young lad and tell me a little bit about your first memories of music and how that early exposure to music affected you. And in addition, do you have any special memories of specific artists or bands or songs associated with that time period? And just as a frame of reference, there's a couple that stand out for me, and and we're close in age. We're very close in age, so we may have some similar reference points. But Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Water was a big one. Carole King, Tapestry was a huge one. Sweet Baby James by James Taylor was another big one. So my mom listened to that kind of early 70s AOR type stuff that is still brilliant to my ears. Still love that music. It's part of my DNA. How about you?
Well, it's weird because my parents were quite young, but they had really old-fashioned tastes. So, they had me in their mid-20s, and they tended to really like the kind of Frank Sinatra generation of singers. So bizarrely, the collection as I was growing up was full of people like Jack Jones, Frank Sinatra, and the Carpenters would have been the cutting-edge contemporary stuff. But I love it. I mean, it's interesting, as you say, that a lot of the albums that were in my parents' collection, I did play and I did like, and I think that they both favoured the ballads as well. So, sad Frank Sinatra concept albums like No One Cares would have been played in the house. My dad was also a massive Neil Diamond fan, and one of the albums that really meant a lot to me when I was really very young was Rainbow. And what was funny is it was Neil Diamond doing cover versions of songs by Randy Newman, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, writers who became incredibly important to me. And we also have the inevitable sort of Beatles greatest hits, the 1967-70 collection and the earlier 162 to 66.
The blue and red ones, right?
The blue and red albums. And Simon and Garfunkel's greatest hits was another one in the house. And I think that the first 2 pieces of music that I remember struck me, and again, it was very early. One was, strangely enough, Simon Smith's Amazing Dancing Bear, which is a Randy Newman track, but I didn't know that at the time. But it was
I don't even know who that is.
Well, it was a huge hit in Britain when I was probably about 2 or 3, and I was constantly wanting this track on, and it turns out to have been written by Randy Newman, whose work I've come to love.
Yeah.
And the other one, which was maybe more significant, was that because my parents rarely got on, my dad was from Lancashire, my mother was from Yorkshire. It was a permanent War of the Roses, if you know about the historical War of the Roses in Britain. And when I was really young, it was incredible that this could happen, because basically I was like 4, 5, 6. My dad would take me to the cinema. And in those days, as you probably remember, cinemas were very clouded with smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd have James Bond nights, because Bond was huge.
Oh, yeah.
At that point. And I suppose the music of John Barry, I was absolutely captivated by. Of course, there was the excitement of being in the cinema, the excitement of seeing the big screen. But as much as that, it was pieces like Capsule in Space from You Only Live Twice. It was the music of Barry, which was somewhere between a kind of melancholy art pop and classical music. And that really transfixed me, and was probably the soundtrack to many a pre-adolescent dream.
Do you have a favorite Bond soundtrack? I think I remember Goldfinger, obviously the song Goldfinger. That was cool. But I mean, that was a good one. And I'm trying to think, was Dr. No before that, or was there?
Dr. No was the first, yeah. I mean, my favorite. I mean, Goldfinger is brilliant throughout, also as a film. But I guess soundtrack wise, You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and and Live and Let Die, actually, because I was huge Paul McCartney fan.
Amazing
as well.
Yeah. So, and I do know you really like soundtracks, so we'll maybe talk a little bit about that in a bit. And I forgot to mention something to you backstage. I'm hoping you'll be game for this. I pulled about 10 or 11 selections from my collection that I'm pretty certain you're going to know all these albums. And I'm curious.
I might disappoint you.
You might, but I don't think so. I think I know you pretty well to know these are probably in your wheelhouse. I didn't go pull out like Autopsy, Mental Funeral, or something like that. And by the way, you do know I'm a metalhead, so it's weird that I came from Simon and Garfunkel and I love death metal. I have Steve to blame for that, by the way. I do. That's a story from another time. But yeah, do you have any, like, again, those 70s soundtracks, obviously, like The Exorcist and, oh, come on now. Michael.
John Carpenter, Halloween.
No, actually, The Exorcist.
Oh, right. You're thinking of John Williams, were you?
You're John Williams, yeah. No, but who did The Exorcist?
The Exorcist, Mike Oldfield. They used Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, yeah.
Mike Oldfield, yeah. That was what I was trying to think of. And I know the Oldfield is pretty near and dear for you. We come up through that period of time. So we'll get to that. Let's get to the next thing. You're known for your voice, of course, but do you have any distinct memories when you realized you could sing, or people around you kind of picked up on that fact that you had a kind of unique timbre and timbre to your voice? Do you remember anything like that? Did you sing in the school choir or that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I was in my primary school choir, and when I got into secondary school, if there had been a choir, I'd have probably been in it, but we didn't have it because I went to a church of England school, and I was in the choir then. And in fact, one of the only notable things on my first ever grammar school report was actually he sings very well, because apparently in the music lessons we had to sing. But it was very difficult because actually I could sing as a choir boy, but when your voice breaks, it becomes incredibly different and quite difficult to navigate initially. But again, sort of going back on music, I suppose that it meant a great deal to me, partly because my upbringing was so weirdly turbulent in a way. My parents were continually having affairs and leaving one another, and it was and I was an only child as well, and they used to leave me to my own devices. So this is one of the reasons why when people ask how I've heard so much music and seen so many films, is that from a very early age I was left on my own, and I could do what the hell I liked. So I could watch late night television, I could listen to music till midnight. And the weird thing is that was my act of rebellion, was kind of discovering feelings in music, in literature, in film. And it was also kind of an escape as well, really.
Wow. When did what was your first instrument that you picked up aside? Because I think you play a bit of more or less everything. What was the first thing you picked up aside your voice? Did you pick up a guitar, or did you take the piano lessons, or
Well, I never
no?
did any of those things. And actually, in terms of sort of guitar, I would say that just working with people like Stephen Wilson has been really instructive, because I'd always just look at where his fingers were on the fretboard, what he
Okay.
was doing. And really, I played Farfisa organ in the first band I
Yeah.
was ever in, partly because the bass player had a Farfisa organ. So I learnt very simple parts to accompany the live band. And I got hold of a really battered guitar, probably late teens. And there was another guitarist as well, who was the first ever No Man guitarist, a guy called Stuart Blagden, who's also known as the Still Owl.
Yep.
And he was a phenomenally gifted guitarist. And he was classically trained, but had also come through jazz and rock. And he was really original in the rock and pop arena, because he wasn't very interested in it. So he was bringing classical techniques, folk techniques, jazz techniques, and weird harmonics that he'd learnt. And he was a sort of a big influence as well. And really, I just learnt enough, I suppose, on keyboard and guitar to write. I've never been particularly interested in being a virtuoso, and very like Stephen, Stephen and I are similar in the sense that we don't pick up our instruments unless we're writing, unless we're creating.
Yeah.
It's not something that we'll be improving our scales. And there's a big difference when we work with people like Stuart Blagden and Ben Coleman, who were amazingly gifted, trained musicians who would constantly reinforce their gift. They would always be rehearsing, playing pieces and so on, reading from, obviously sheet music. And Stephen and I, in a sense, I think our creativity was always a very instinctive one. It was just that everything resulted from feelings. Everything resulted from, okay, how am I now in this moment? This is what I'm doing.
Right.
And then the instrument and the studio speaks. So, the creative process is one that I thoroughly enjoy and always have done. Writing to me, it's like, I still prefer writing and creating music really to performing live. It's that thing that when you've written something new and you feel you're in a fresh place, there's no feeling better than that. And also, if you've captured an emotion that you're going through in your music, there's kind of
I remember talking to Steve one time. We were at the PRS event down, and I don't know what year this was. Might have been 05, 06, and we were kind of walking around, and I'm like, I'm a guitar nerd. I like to talk about the technical. I'm a guy that does sit and practice, and I don't know that I get any better. I do. I actually do. But I mean, I'll sit it down for a while and then come back to it. But talking to Steve about it, I'm all nerding out on guitars, and he kind of looks at me and he goes, guitars are like pens to a writer for me. They're an instrument to create. I don't really want to sit. Steve wasn't interested in being a shredder, and he's not. The thing about Steve is he's a much better guitar player than he kind of gives himself credit for being.
Yeah, no, he's very good. And I think one of the things that Stephen's always had, though, is an ability to mimic whatever a piece needs or whatever a mood needs. And he finds a way to do it. I think that he's always been quite masterful in the studio. And again, I think both of us have always kind of realized that often you can create things that are meaningful using very few musical components. You can also create something that sounds great with sometimes terrible playing, because actually it's the overall sound,
Right.
And I think that's the thing that maybe both of us had, was a kind of an holistic view of what a song should be. So, at the moment I've started work on something I might not complete, but it's really new for me, which is a completely solo album. It's me playing everything.
Oh, wow.
And it's been a real learning process. I think that when I get into these things, I get into it quite seriously, and I've got about 16 pieces, 35 minutes, so they're very short pieces generally. And I think that's the thing that I realized, we've got certain shared views of it's the holistic.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute, because I'm going to get to the No Man stuff, and I want to actually kind of really zoom in on that. Let me finish up with some of these questions that are kind of generic about your formative years. So you kind of play a little bit of everything. Do you actually play the drums too, or do you just sample it?
No, not really. I mean, if ever Andy Booker, unfortunately for him, leaves his kit empty, I will sit on that seat. And it's interesting with drumming, because I think that requires a very particular type of skill set, one that I really don't have. And so with drumming, I can do the hands. So actually, I can do some fairly complicated rhythms with my hands. I cannot coordinate my feet with that.
I can't either. I cannot either. I suck at it. I cannot do the, I can't figure it out. My brain doesn't want to do that. It's so cool that you said that.
And I think this is why, drummers, in a way, people always say that kind of drummers, vocalists, they're wired differently, that they have very different personalities. And to a degree, that is true, that, drummers I've worked with have tended to be the more obsessive, the more eccentric. And so it requires a particular type of mind to master the drum kit. And it's definitely one I've not got. Of course, I can kind of program rhythms, but interestingly enough, when it comes to sort of programming rhythms, I really like the basics. So I like very early drum machines that sound like terrible drum machines, because they're not pretending to be anything other than what they are. And I think that although it's got a lot better now, and it really has got a lot better now.
Of course,
I'm less keen on using, a lot of the supposedly state-of-the-art drum samples or drum programs you can use, which kind of mimic real drummers. And because I don't know, it's my prejudice, but I can always hear, for me, there's always a certain feel missing, which is why I tend to like kind of really cheap, cheesy, artificial drum machines.
So I'm gathering you probably love the early Sisters of Mercy albums then, because of that drum machine, right?
Well, actually, I do like the sound of that, because it's incredibly simple programming and an incredibly simple sound, but it sounds like itself. And it is, you're right. And I think that actually when No Man first started, we used to alternate, really. There were a couple of sort of areas we'd operate in. One was a more ethereal ballad territory that both of us were very drawn to, and that perhaps found its way out on the album Speak. This was our earlier work.
So beautiful. So beautiful.
Thank you. Well, it's one that meant a lot, so this is very early stuff that, for us, we felt it kind of tapped into something quite timeless. It was written between 87, 89, and we'd have been very interested in artists like Cocktail Twins, This Mortal Coil, Dead Can Dance, and so on. But we were also really steeped in timeless singer-songwriters, Nick Drake, John Martin, Sandy Denny, Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins even, so we were very aware of these things. And I felt there was a kind of timelessness. But when we weren't doing that, we were often doing some really kind of noisy, industrial, programmed drum beat stuff, which I guess has got something spiritually in common with that kind of early Sisters of Mercy style.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that stuff, and we're definitely gonna talk about Speak, because it ranks super, super high for me. I think it's almost a perfect album. It really is. It's just so incredible. Real quick, we kind of touched on this. How nurturing were your parents about your decision, and when did you kind of decide I want to be a professional musician, or did it just kind of happen?
I think I'd always had dreams to be in a band. I mean, music meant a hell of a lot to me. And as I said, I think it was a kind of a comfort. It was, my safety, whatever they call it, security blanket, safety blanket, whatever it is. And so I kind of burrowed myself deep into music from quite a young age. And my early ventures into music, I'd have been singing really Beatles 10cc songs into a cassette recorder. and doing it really, really badly.
Yeah.
Probably some Simon and Garfunkel as well, actually. And so I would just kind of sing along to certain pieces in a cassette recorder that I had. And I talk about being in bands with friends at school, and a few had similar dreams. And I remember one particular time when I was probably about, I'm guessing 14. And it was when music hit me even more deeply that we were playing at summer holidays, 76. And we were playing Sabutio, which is a sort of game of table football that you may not know, in table soccer, as you might call it. And a friend brought his dad's collection of cassettes, and cassettes at the time, that was the state of the art sound system. Yeah. And my dad had his sound system, of course, as well. So in the background, it was the first time I'd ever heard stuff like Pink Floyd, Tangerine Dream, Mike Oldfield, Led Zeppelin as well. So we were just kind of playing things like Physical Graffiti, Metal, Wish You Were Here, Tubular Bells, Phaedra. And the one that, there were certain things that certain grit me. And one was Led Zeppelin's Kashmir. I remember being overwhelmed by the power of that. When you were a 12-year-old hearing this for the first time, and of course it would have only been out a year at that point.
Right.
And the other one, again, it would have been out a year, was in particular Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. It was just so atmospheric, so beautiful. And because it was my house, I could demand which cassettes were on. So I kept on putting on this.
You were in control.
And it was one of the first albums I ever bought. And again, being absolutely besotted with that polythene, cellophane, whatever it was, that cellophane sleeve, the postcards. The artwork was as enigmatic, atmospheric, and seemingly meaningful as the music. So I think that definitely, also pushed me towards it. And anyway, so my sort of family life became more chaotic. So when I was 15, I say it's all sort of out there in various interviews, but my mum was killed in a car crash when I was 15. And as I said, my parents had split up quite a number of times before then. It's like my dad recently reminded me of something I'd completely forgotten, where my mum had left us for 6 months. And I'd blanked out of my mind. I'd been about 9 or 10.
Wow.
And my dad had left for about a year as well. So, it was constantly like this. But there's a particular period when I was 15 and my mum was killed in a car crash. And within this then was the beginning of kind of a hellish year, really, the annus horribilis. And my grandmother, who'd always had mental health issues, had about 3 severe mental breakdowns. It's my paternal grandmother, and she lived next door to me. So, I'd come home from school and there would be men in white coats with a stretcher, and my grandmother pleading me to get her off the stretcher. And, my grandfather died of a heart attack. My maternal grandparents were absolutely devastated by the loss of my mother. And my dad completely lost control more than before. So weirdly, from 15, I kind of lived on my own. And as I've said, rather than sort of getting into, because my parents both smoked heavily and drank heavily, and it put me off smoking and drinking for life.
Wow.
And so I've never ever partaken, shall we say?
No kidding. Never.
Yeah. So just put off by my parents, really. And I was just left on my own, and so I could just listen to music, make music, write, read, watch any old art house or horror film 3 a.m, because no one was there to stop me. And I guess, as I've said, that was kind of my act of rebellion, and I just decided that I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and that was music. And my mother was dead, but my father was dead against it. Basically he wanted me to have a very straight civil service job, working for the government, because I'd kind of come through the whole grammar school system. You get your qualifications, you go into the civil service. There you've got your life, your job for life, and so on. And I objected to this strongly. So he was very, very anti, very sometimes aggressively anti, and that also came from my grandparents who were alive, my maternal grandparents at this point, having phone call interventions to prevent me from doing this stupid thing. And the same with my uncle, who ironically was an artist and was head of an arts college, but he was saying, no, some of my students have got record deals. Believe me, it always ends in disaster. So it was, I was having interventions, arguments, but, I pursued it because I felt that I had the freedom to do this. And I also had, an incredible drive to write and make music.
How's your relationship with your dad now?
Well, he's now 84 and,
right.
It's a very different life. He's not worked since his late 40s. He was ill from a fairly early age, possibly because of all the smoking and drinking. He had heart attacks in his 30s. He's had cancer twice.
Wow.
Strokes, you name it.
So he's lucky to be here.
Yeah, now he's got debilitating Parkinson's.
Wow. My dad's starting that right now. He's started in the last year. That's why I'm kind of caretaking for him. And did you say you've never smoked and never drank in your life?
I drank up until the age of 18, and then almost as a joke saying, right, this is where I stop. And I stopped, which is the legal age of consent
in
because of course, drink was always around me, so I could drink, and I was given, I think I was one of those classic northern babies that to get me to sleep, it was Bullsfoot baby, whiskey. And so on. I think I was probably sleeping on whiskey as a 6-month
Good Lord.
And certainly with kind of smoking and drugs, just seeing, my parents would kind of chain smoker. So I remember, if we ever went on a holiday, we'd be going on 6.5-hour car journeys.
Oh my God.
And when you're in this car full of smoke, I would just be there with stomach cramps in the back of the car reading books.
Yeah, I haven't smoked since my late 20s when my kids came along. I just quit, and I hate it now. Absolutely loathe the smell of cigarette smoke.
Well, it's interesting because I don't smoke and don't drink now. I'm sure that my son, who's now 12, he's probably going to become a complete addict. He's going to go the opposite.
Let's hope. Let's hope not.
Yeah, it's exactly. But so yes, it wasn't remotely nurturing at all, and it still isn't. I mean, if you talk about relationship, we get on. I mean, basically, we can talk about politics. He's a bright guy, so we can talk about history. We can talk about politics. We can sometimes talk about the past. Like as I said, he told me the story about my mother having left when I was 9, 10, and going, "What? You really don't remember this?" And saying, "No, I've got no memory of it whatsoever."
Wow.
So we can talk and we get on. So to a certain extent, we can, and we always have, got on well if we're operating in areas of interest that are his.
Yeah, certain parameters. That's like me and my old man. My old man we don't have a lot of commonalities at all. He's a Trump guy. He's a racist guy. He's a homophobe. I'm all those things to the other way. I'm a centrist, but I'm far more of a liberal socially. So we never talk politics, or if we do, it doesn't go well. But I remember getting a magazine a couple years ago with David Bowie on the cover, who, by the way, is my favorite, and I know he's a favorite of yours too.
He is, yeah.
And my dad says, "Who the hell is that blank?" And I said, "Really, dude? Really?" So we coexist, and generally, if we don't get into politics or social issues that he doesn't, he's still stuck in 1954, where Black people behave the way that they should behave, and there were no gay people. There were gay people. Trust me, they were everywhere back then. They just were in hiding because they feared for their lives. But that's that kind of mentality, and it's really difficult. But somebody's got to take care of him because he's getting ill, and I have my own illness issues to deal with. So I need some kind of roof over my head. You know what I mean? So I can feel you, Tim. I definitely feel you. You were saying about the Pink Floyd and Zeppelin stuff. That's mid-70s for you?
Mid-70s, yeah.
Yeah, and you were exposed to that with your friends?
Yeah, I was, and some of my friends became similarly obsessed. To go back to my parents, I was going to say politically, actually, he's always been quite. The things that I'd say that were positive of my parents is that they were fundamentally decent people and fundamentally liberal. So in this country, they were actually both activists for the Liberal Party.
Mm-hmm.
So they had quite sort of centre left views and were always very welcoming. So in that sense, the one thing I would say was very good about my upbringing is I think they both liked me. They hated one another, but they both liked me, and they were very liberal. And also there was no sexism, no racism in our household. And in terms of sexism, I was brought up in an unusual way in the sense that my mum had a job that was as good as my dad, and that went back also to my grandparents, where both sets of grandparents pretty much had the same job. So I was never brought up around any kind of sexism. And the weirdest thing was in my first year at the grammar school, and you've got to remember this is a very middle-class English grammar school,
Mm-hmm.
there was a debate, should women be paid the same amount as men for doing the same job? Now, there is no debate. It's a brainless question. Of course they should. We shouldn't be debating it. And I was the only boy who voted, well,
Yes.
yeah. And that was one of the only times at school where I got kicked to the ground, my bag kicked, my school books ripped.
No kidding, really?
Yeah, but luckily I sort of avoided any kind of bullying, partly because I could be a bit of a class joker, and partly because I was okay at sport. So I was decent. I was on the verge of school team and on school team occasionally for things like football and athletics. So I think that kind of helps, despite perhaps my interests not particularly being shared by a lot of the people.
Yeah, that athletic thing always seemed to be, I tried to be an athlete, and I was usually not very, the track team, over here what we call soccer, you call football.
Yeah.
Tried to be that. I was always like the worst player, and made it for like a year or two, and I was like, yeah. And then I focused on guitar and music and that kind of stuff like that. But of course, when I got to the end of school, I had the pressure of, well, I got to go to college. I got to get a real job. I can't be a musician. That's not going to pay me. And so I didn't chase that path, which I wish I would have. But real quick, what was your first album that you bought with your own money, and what was your first concert?
First album was probably the Pink Floyd album, Wish You Were Here. First single was 10cc's I'm Not in Love.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up. Is that, you may disagree, but I'm going to make a statement.
Go on.
Is I'm Not in Love the most incredible recorded piece of music ever? That vocal section, mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing.
Oh, it's stunning. Yeah. And still, I think I kind of use ideas that are sort of influenced by it. That and its B-side, Good News, that was sung by Kevin Godley. Yeah, absolutely beautiful pieces of music that I just kind of played again and again, really. And also for me, what was interesting is that I was brought up in Cheshire, in between Manchester and Liverpool, and 10cc were from Cheshire. They were from sort of the areas of Manchester quite near me. So at the time, and it sounds kind of stupid because it was such a sort of dull, unglamorous place that I was brought up in. It was kind of amazing to me that two of my greatest pop heroes, the Beatles and 10cc, came from within a 20-minute radius of where I was.
That's crazy.
And that was sort of inspiring, really, because you thought, well, look, I know that Paul McCartney is a damn sight more gifted than me, but if people can succeed from this area, they can succeed from this area. And there was also a series of films in the 60s, the kitchen sink films, which I used to love, kind of art house British films that would be set in Manchester, Liverpool, Taste of Honey, films like this that I was
I've never seen any of those.
Brought up on. And also there were a series of poets called the Mersey Poets. And again, when I was very young, my mum bought me this Mersey Poets book with people like Roger McGough, Brian Patton, Adrian Henry. And I became obsessed with this book of poetry when I was about 12 as well. And that kind of coincided with my interest in music. And once more, they were from the Northwest. So although it was kind of internationally successful and spoke a global language, it was coming from this very specific place in England where I was brought up.
That's really cool. What was your first concert? Do you remember?
First concert. Now, I always say that I've had, like this 51st Dates or whatever that film is.
Right.
I've got several first concerts. So when I was about 10, because of the success probably of The Sting, I remember being dragged into a piano concert of Scott Joplin.
Oh, yeah?
Very good.
How about that?
So I remember that. So Scott Joplin.
Pretty cool.
Then when I was slightly older, my parents were arguing so much, they decided they were trying to make the marriage work, and they bought themselves tickets for a festival. But then inevitably they fell out so badly that I ended up going with my friends to the concerts. So I went to see people like George Melly and John Chilton's Feet Warmers, who were sort of early jazz. Okay. Dixieland. So, and strangely, even when I was about 15, 16, myself and my friends, we'd go to any music gigs in town. And we were in a very unfashionable part of the Northwest. So the only gigs we got to see were metal gigs in pubs. So actually, when I was 15, I saw Iron Maiden play in one of my local pubs.
No way. That's so cool.
Diamond Head, Witchfind. Then
I'm so jealous right now.
On the other side, we'd go and see Dixieland jazz people play at another pub. So we were just kind of soaking it all in, really. But then, a week after my mum was killed, my uncle, who'd never been particularly friendly, took me in for a week because my dad couldn't cope with everything. And he just was incredibly friendly. The only time in his life he was ever friendly, but he got me on the guest list backstage to see Thin Lizzy. Now, I didn't really know who Thin Lizzy were. But
what year is this? What year is this?
This was Bradford St. George's Hall.
What year is this?
1979, April.
Wow.
And I was operating the house lights, and then I was taken backstage to meet Phil Lynott, Scott Gorham. Gary Moore was the guitarist at the time.
Oh, my God.
And Phil Lynott was lovely. I've got to say, Phil Lynott and Scott Gorham could not have been sweeter.
Yeah.
Brian Downey Jr. was taciturn, and Gary Moore was positively hostile. and I sort of remember there was a conversation where basically Moore was making it, pretty obvious, like, what the fuck is this teenager doing here, this young kid? And Phil Lynott shot him a glance and said, his mother's just been killed. Shut the fuck up.
Oh, wow.
And then turned around and was nice. So it's
now, your uncle knew somebody, or did he work there?
Yeah,
or?
He was involved in the entertainment field in Bradford at the time. So he got me, in to see Leeds United free, which I'm sure would not be something you know of in America as well. So these were my treats. Insane. So anyway, but the first gig I paid for, which is what I see as one, was when I was 16. And I was underage. One of my heroes was Robert Fripp, because when I was 15, I discovered King Crimson, and I became absolutely obsessive about Crimson. You're going on at Bowie. Bowie was one of my favorite artists, and Crimson, of course, Fripp had been on Heroes and on Scary Monsters, and he was playing at the Manchester Polytechnic. So at the age of 16, I paid to go and see Robert Fripp and the League of Gentlemen. As I said, basically, I could kind of do what I wanted. So I could just get on trains and go to Liverpool, go to Manchester, see gigs. So Robert Fripp and the League of Gentlemen was the first gig that I paid to see. And this was the strategy. I remember everything about it. It was a really scummy venue with a hole in the ceiling. And I remember the disco because it was playing stuff like, the cutting edge sounds of the day, like Gang of Four, XTC Magazine, Joy Division, stuff that I loved. And then it would also intersperse this with Peter Gabriel, Peter Hamill, and so on. So it's a really interesting disco. And I got to see all of Barry Andrews' Restaurant for Dogs set. And he did Chic's Le Freak, which was great. And did an encore of it. And then Robert Fripp came on, did a speech about please don't take photographs.
He was doing that then.
I was doing it then. And then 3 songs into it, I looked at my watch and I had to run back and get the train. So that was the first gig
really?
I'd ever paid for. I saw 3 songs of Robert Fripp's League of Gentlemen.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's awesome, man. There's some great stories there. All right, Tim. So let's talk about what your first real band was. Was it plenty? Was it still? I'm a little confused. Or was there something else in there that I missed?
Well, it depends what you regard as first band. The first time I managed to get people in a room to make a sound as a band and do a gig, it was a very uninspired project. We were called Horizon. It really was a case of friends getting together because we had instruments. Some of the musicians were good, some weren't so good. I was horrendous, but I probably had the no, I wouldn't say the biggest ego, but probably the biggest drive, I think. And we probably sounded like a cross between Fairport Convention and Velvet Underground. And it wasn't because it was intentional, it was just we didn't know what we were doing when we wrote songs. And at that time, it was early 80s, the band's influences were very much kind of the new wave scene that was happening, especially in Manchester and Liverpool. We had Zoo label and Factory Records, and then also progressive music that we all liked. So it was a kind of a combination that we all really liked. That was two of the things we all liked. I mean, I personally liked classical, jazz, lots of other things as well. But two things we all liked were certain progressive rock bands and certain new wave post-punk bands.
Right.
And then that morphed into a band with a friend of mine from school, a guy called Robert Whitrow, called The Roaring Silence. And that was a lot better, musically pretty accomplished, really. But again, the direction was fairly all over the place. You know, it would be, because this was the early 80s, and it would go from sort of Aztec Camera, Haircut 100, almost funk pop, to Joy Division, doom post-punk, to Moving Pictures style prog excursions. You know, it was all over the shop.
Holy mackerel. Quick question there. Roaring Silence, you said, correct?
Yeah.
Did you steal that from
Roaring Silence?
Did you steal that from
I didn't know this at the time, but yeah, it was stolen by the guitarist from a book of Hypnosis album covers that he had, and that was where he got the name from.
One of the best too.
Yeah, probably, I have heard it. Subsequently, I have heard it, so I do know the album.
Yeah.
And but the first proper band, the first one where I thought, okay, this works, was Still, and I was still in my teens, and it was just an original combination of influences. This was the first time where we were making music that was coming directly from improvisation, inspiration. And I was working with two really creative musicians, a guy called Tony Cottrell, who played synth and bass, and Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl. And I think we did produce something that was kind of slightly beyond category, because we were bringing in influences from jazz, classical, post-punk. And we very quickly got picked up by major radio stations in Liverpool and Manchester. And a guy who's still very important in British radio called Mark Radcliffe referred to us as the most important band from Manchester since Joy Division. So, you know, this is pretty serious stuff. But it really imploded very, very quickly. And then for about 2 years, I was in a solo project called Always the Stranger. And this would be me bringing in musicians from all sorts of disciplines and mainly recording rather than playing live. And that developed into a band called After the Stranger. And we released my very first album with After the Stranger. It was a vinyl album. And I kind of forced everybody into this because I said, look, we've got to get to another label. At that stage, we were releasing cassettes and getting decent local radio play and occasionally international play. And the album was released, and it really was not as good as a lot of what came before it, but it did the trick. It got reviewed properly in a lot of places. And after that point, and it also was one of the first times when I'd worked with Brian Hulse. Because I think that, you know, Still was the first band that was really doing something interesting. Although I don't think, you know, I wasn't up to the job, really. I think that the band was great. The sound we were making was really original. And I think I was probably partly responsible for that originality, because I think that my drive and my influences helped. But I don't think that what I was offering lyrically or musically was particularly good. You know, I mean, I know it sounds odd here, but I think it was partly because a lot of the things I was talking to you about my, you know, my mum's death when I was 15, about my grandmother's nervous breakdowns, and really hideous family life for
right.
about a good 5 years. I was still in that. I was still in my
Yeah.
teens.
Yeah, right.
And when I listen to some of that stuff now, all I hear is this kind of really undisciplined, really unhappy teenager. So I think that while the band were good, I think I was utterly shit. And I think that when I started to get all right, was we did this after the Stranger album. I think after the Stranger started, in fact, this is probably it actually. We released this album. I didn't feel it was good, but we released it and we got reviewed everywhere and mostly favorably. And we got a few radio plays. But I think I was listening to that. One listen of that album, I heard all that was wrong in my singing and my lyrics.
Okay.
And it was when I finally heard myself on vinyl, if this makes any sense. I listened to the vinyl and I listened to myself on cassette, no problem. Listened to it on vinyl. And I thought, this is horrendous.
Yep.
And it was one of the biggest cases of self-education, of learning that I've ever had, listening to myself do this, you know, on vinyl in the format that I listened to everybody else. And I realized what was missing, what was woeful. And I would say that within a month of that, my singing style, my lyrical style, the way in which I engaged with music changed. And this coincided with me working with Brian Hulse. And I'll tell you a story about Brian. Basically, when I was 19, I saw an advert for a band in a local music shop. It was called A Better Mousetrap. And they were rehearsing in Liverpool, and it was this particular place called The Ministry, I think. And this is where Teardrop Explodes, Dead or Alive, Echo and the Bunnymen, all of the big Liverpool bands were rehearsing, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. And I went for the audition. They needed a singer. And I loved it. I loved their music. They were in this kind of very creative post-punk territory, you know, sort of post-magazine, Joy Division, but they were very musical. And of course, they had roots in jazz, in classical, in progressive rock. So this came through their music. And the interesting thing is that I did the audition. Now, I was probably utterly horrendous, but the bass player liked me enough to take my name. This is Dave Jones, who I still work with.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Brian has very little memory of it. But what was written down, this is quite funny, is I nearly got the job, but I didn't get the job for two reasons. One, I was too young because I was in my teens and they were in their mid-20s. And I think they probably thought I was going to be a bit of an arrogant firebrand and very different.
Right.
And number two, I sounded too like their previous singer, Peter Goddard, who I've subsequently come to know. So I was it was like, oh no, he's too like our previous singer. And part of the reason for that was probably that we had certain similarities. And part of the reason was that, of course, I'd learnt the material from the demo tapes featuring Peter. So I was probably mimicking Peter's style when I was doing the audition. But anyway, for whatever reason, I kept in touch with them. And on this album I was telling you about, the self-financed album that's released on vinyl, I got Brian involved to play keyboards. And we just got very close. And suddenly we started writing. And this is the first time, it was 1986. And it's the first time I thought, I'm writing something of value. You know, I'd been writing for about 5 years, but for me, the singing, the writing, everything was overblown. And when I was writing with Brian, although, as I said, after The Stranger and Always the Stranger, there were some good pieces. There was an intensity and there were some good musicians. I think I was the weak link. But I think when I worked with Brian and David, suddenly, this was 86, I was working with people who were 5-6 years older than me, which is important at that stage.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, I was free because I lived on my own. This is something I've not said. I lived on my own from the age of about 16, 17.
Right.
So basically, I could stay up as long as I like, read as many books as I wanted,
stay out
listen to as much music. Yeah. So, you know, I basically absorbed literature, films, music, and was always hungry to learn more. And Brian and David were highly intelligent. They had fantastic record and book collections. So it was a real learning process for me. And I think suddenly it was a combination of me hearing myself on that vinyl album. When I heard myself as I heard others, I thought, I'm shit. And that was really a big learning curve. Secondly, I suddenly started working with Brian, who was so much more mature than the people I'd been working with. And I really think that, the beginnings of music that I can still listen to. In fact, recently we released a Plenty album. During the pandemic, we released a Plenty album. And we released several demos from the early 80s. Sorry, the mid 80s.
Let's do this because so Plenty was the band that morphed and was created with Brian, or and was Bear Park involved in that or not?
Yeah, what happened with that one really is that I started writing with Brian. Brian and I just got on very, very well, and I loved his work. And I think he felt I was a stronger singer. Brian's got a really lovely voice, actually, but I think I've probably got a more characterful voice. And so he wanted to work with me, and we just started writing together. And then I brought in Michael Bear Park, who was very young at the time, 15, 16. And he brought in Dave from his previous band, A Better Mousetrap, the band I'd auditioned for when I was a teenager. And we had this day. So Brian and I had been writing together for probably about 6 months. And a couple of those tracks did end up, I think, on one of the Plenty CDs we released during the pandemic. And I still really like them. It was the first time I felt I was releasing music that I would listen to and buy myself. And I think that because I'd heard myself sing on the After the Stranger album, I realized what was missing in what I did, what was wrong. And so suddenly it was the combination that I think I'd learned what was wrong with my singing. And then I was working with someone who was a hell of a lot more mature than I was, who I wanted to impress.
Yeah. So he was kind of like a mentor to you in a lot of ways.
I think to an extent, yeah, though I hope that we inspired one another really. But it was an important relationship. And he and I started writing. And then we said, well, let's make it into a band. So I brought in Michael, who had been in my band After the Stranger, and he brought in David, who had been in his band, A Better Mousetrap.
Mm-hmm. This is the album right here that came out, I believe, in 2021, right?
Yeah, that's the one. And that's got some of the original demos that we did. And actually, I'm still really pleased with The Other Side from 1986. It was the first thing I did. I thought, yes, this is quite good. Before that, I'd had... there was a band I was in called Still, which is the one I was telling you about in Manchester with older musicians. And we got a lot of radio play. This is the one that, as I said, Mark Radcliffe had said was one of the most important bands from Manchester and since Joy Division and so on. And we got a lot of radio play. But the first band I felt was good that I've been in was really Plenty with Brian and David. And it was a combination of myself and Michael being younger, Brian and David being older.
So this one right here, Tim, it's called Older?
Which one?
The one that's I have the picture up of.
Oh, yeah, it's part of it. The album.
Talk about the album real quick. I mean, and those demos, those original demos from the 80s, are they 4-track demos or 8-track demos or what are they?
I think they start off being Porter Studio demos, being 4-track Porter Studio demos.
4 tracks, right. Okay.
And then I think we progressed to going into an 8-track studio somewhere in Knutsford, which is on the Cheshire side of Manchester. But yeah, it was a real period where I think I felt I connected. The first time I think I made music that I would want to listen to, that I felt very connected to. Michael left fairly early on. He's now Professor Michael Bear Park. He went to university during that period that we were working together. I carried on working with Brian and David, and I still have incredible affection for that material and still rate it. This is one of the reasons why I reconvened working with Brian and David, because I always felt that music was amongst my best music, and I never wanted it to fade away. And so we came back to it years later when I felt maybe all of us had slightly more ability to perform the material better. But then, the demos that are on the flip side of that album, I think are pretty good.
Yeah, they're not bad. There's a video up of one of the songs. I forget the name of the song. You have a video up with the old footage, and I forget I noted it, but I forgot to note it here. But there's also newer material that was done, I guess, during the pandemic on here.
Some of it, yeah. I mean, certainly in terms
Great.
of recording, yeah. The first side was all material that we're doing. That started off basically when Brian and I, just for fun, really, started recording some covers, and then
Oh, that's right. There's 5 covers on
yeah.
here, right?
And then we thought, you know what, we're going to record all the Plenty material that we didn't record for the previous Plenty album.
Ah.
And it was great. It was really enjoyable to do, and I think we put that material to bed. I mean, I say that, but myself, David, and Brian, we're working on re-recording Plenty material now. You know, it's obviously an evolving process, so we're doing some more Plenty old material. But yeah, it was kind of a pandemic exercise. I mean, what's happened to me over the last few albums is that when I finished an album, I kind of usually felt quite drained. So when I'd done Flowers at the Scene, I didn't feel like writing, and I can happily have 9 months, 10 months, 11 months not picking up a guitar, not doing anything, and then the ideas hit me. And I think this would have been just after Late Night Laments, and I really didn't feel like doing anything. But Brian and I thought, you know what, let's just record some covers for fun during the pandemic period, because I wanted to keep in the habit of recording, of making music. And then that extended to us doing the Plenty songs. And then eventually, after about 10 months, I wrote something which became the foundation of the next solo album.
Oops.
Butterfly Mind.
Yeah, I wanted to show this, which is the 2018 album, right? It Could Be Home. This is all new material, or is it older songs?
No, this is all old material. So basically, what we did with that album, we worked with Jakob Holm Looper, who did a great mix of it.
Yeah, White Willow.
We gave him the brief. In a sense, it was the debut album we never made. It was the one we wanted to make in the 80s. So it includes 9 tracks that we wrote in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And it includes 1 brand new track that we wrote. And the idea with the soundscape, we strictly limited ourselves to 1980s soundscapes of when the album would have been released.
Right.
So in a sense, it's the unreleased debut album that we wanted to release in 1988, but never could.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really good.
So thank you. You know, it's great fun doing. Whereas the second Plenty album came out of the pandemic, really, of Brian and I recording cover versions, and then just redoing the Plenty songs that we hadn't redone for It Could Be Home.
Right.
And we sort of applied a more liberal approach to that. We weren't going to say, okay, this is the late 1980s album. It never was. We were just recording it as we were in the moment, really. And then we put the original demos on the second disc. Mm-hmm. And it was a great thing, because what I kind of find is that when you're not writing, reassessing old material is one of the greatest creative kickstarts you can have. So, you know, after I'd done albums like, you know, Late Night Laments and so on, I just didn't feel like writing. I was exhausted. And also, you know, it was a fairly difficult time globally as well. And so for me, losing myself in the older music of Plenty, that's what, you know, Brian and I did during a lot of that time. So yeah, and so I was in Plenty, and we were getting, this was the first time I felt I was in a band that I really wanted to be in. Still, the band I was in with Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl, and Tony Cottrell in Manchester, that was very good, but I think I was a definite weak link. Whereas I think with Plenty, I think we were all equal to each other and producing strong work. But during that time was when I came into contact with a certain Mr. Stephen Wilson.
Yes, I was going to segue into that really quickly. The one thing I did want to add, which you already kind of detailed quite a bit there, is that those relationships with Brian and Mr. Jones and Michael Barrack Park, and I don't know if Chilvers was back then. I guess he came in at a later date. But all these guys, all these guys, you maintain good relationships with, and they've come with you in various forms throughout your solo career, some of your other projects like Samuel Smiles, which we'll talk about. And so these are important friendships for you, in addition to being working relationships, right?
Yeah, very much so. I think that, this is the period when I started meeting the people that I was working with, that we were producing the music we wanted to produce, and we had lifelong friendships as well. Before that, between the ages of 18 and 22, I probably did have bands that we were totally mismatched, where player A wanted to be in this type of band, player B wanted to be in that type of band, player C wanted an entirely different. The first band I was telling you about that I was in, the drummer was a Weather Report jazz fan, the bass player and the keyboard player wanted to be in the Stranglers, the guitarist wanted to be in Rush.
That's an interesting mix there, though.
It was an interesting mix, and that can work. My tastes encompassed all of that,
everything,
and more, So, and I think this was something, certainly when I started working with Michael Bear Park, with David, with Brian, this was the time when these are people I worked with. But Stuart Blagden was still out. I worked with him first in.
Well, he came into No Man,
and he came into No Man. Yeah.
Let's segue into that. So, talk about how you and Stephen connected. I know the story, but my viewers, which we've been up around 15 and we've been vacillating. It is, keep in mind, here in the States, it's very early in the morning, so a lot of people are working right now.
15 people. Now, hopefully more will listen to it.
They will. It'll come along as the thing. Because this is, like you said, you asked me, this will be up in perpetuity, no matter what happens to me.
Incriminating.
Yeah. So talk about how you and Stephen came together. Give us a detailed, thing there, because that's the big moment for you in a lot of ways, because your partnership creates this incredible wealth of beautiful music, and I'd like my viewers to understand how that came together.
Well, I think if you're talking about great moments, I think that when I formed the band still with Stuart Blagden and Tony Cottrell, that was making music I wanted to make. That I thought was genuinely quite original. We got picked up on, as I've said, by a lot of Manchester and Liverpool radio shows and got very good reviews in local papers. I wasn't up to it. There was no doubt. I think they were very good. And I think that Plenty was the first time where all of us were up to it and all of us loved it. And it was a real wrench to leave that band. What happened is that I was ambitious. And to a degree, I still am. I would send my demo tapes and my solitary vinyl album everywhere, and got local radio play, some international play, especially in Italy. And Stephen read several of these reviews because I did a weird one-off project, which I've not discussed. It was my solo project, was Always the Stranger. Right. And this generally was my songs, and I'd get people in to record them. And it was very experimental and very dark. And I think it probably was a kind of legacy of the turmoil that I'd had between 79, 80, when, as I've said, my mother was killed in a car crash. Two of my grandparents died. One, that I was closest to. And I was basically living on my own from that age. And of 15, 16. And I think a lot of the music I was making was quite tortured. And maybe the first time I worked with Brian was the time when I kind of focused that torture, if you like. It wasn't overwhelming. This is where I was responding to the music, responding to the mood. It was less dramatic. And I was getting reviews in lots of places, and Stephen was similarly ambitious, and he read some of these reviews. And I did a project with a guy who was a lot older than me called Robert Cox. It was part of my solo project, Always the Stranger. And I traveled across the country to work with this guy who was in his 30s. I was still probably only about 21, something like that. And he was in his early 30s with a family. And he was an experimental composer, and he'd written an advert in Melody Maker. And the advert was from about 1978. And I'd seen this old Melody Maker. Wow. And this was 1985. Yeah, and right. I responded to his advert 7 years later.
No kidding.
And he was so impressed with this. He said, well, look, come on over. So I travelled all the way from Cheshire to Felixstowe on the coast of Suffolk. And he was great. In his collection was very eclectic. He was a obsessed with avant-garde classical, minimalist classical, which I also liked, jazz, but also had a brilliant rock collection, singer-songwriter collection. So he introduced me to a lot of things. And he produced one of my solo Always the Stranger cassettes. Now, I think it was awful. It was awful primarily because of me. It was musically very interesting, but it was awful primarily because of me, because I was certainly still going through my tortured killing cats at a pace stage. And, you know, it got very good reviews, but this is the bizarre thing. We sent the cassette out and we were ending up in major British press, cassette of the month in at least 2 of the big music magazines in Britain. Now, Stephen was at that time just hunting for anything interesting to be on compilation albums.
Yeah.
So he read a review of this, me getting cassette of the month, because it gave your address. It used to give you a home address in these things.
Yeah, right.
And Stephen wrote to me and sent me a cassette of what he was working on. And I thought it was great. And he said, look, do you want to contribute to my album that I'm putting together, compilation album?
Tim, this is the Exposure album.
This is
right?
the Expose It.
Yeah, right.
I think he had initially done Expose It, then it was Exposure, I think.
Okay. Right.
And he sent me his music and then said, I'm always looking for collaborators as well. So I thought there was tremendous talent in what he'd sent me, and I phoned him up. We talked about music a lot. We sent one another mixtapes of things that we loved. And this was happening during my period with Plenty. And then I went on the train to Hemel Hempstead. We started working, and it was great because Stephen and we met, it would have been, I think, it's the summer of 1987 is what I do know. Whether it's June, July, or August, I'm not sure, but it was the summer of 1987.
Now, not to interrupt, but it's interesting to note here, Steve's only like 20 years old, right?
At that stage, yeah.
Yeah, and you're like 23, 24 in that range, right?
I think when we met, probably he was 19 and I was 23.
Wow. Okay.
And
so you headed over to Hemel Hempstead.
I headed over to Hemel Hempstead, and we just talked. We talked about music, comedy, books for about 4 hours, and this kind of set the template for how we used to work. And we got on automatically, you know, something I hope that comes through the album years as well, because we were both kind of enthusiasts. We both wanted to learn more. And we then just set about writing. And it was very different from how I was with Brian. Brian is a much more meticulous writer and player. He's very good. And when we worked on Plenty material and when we still write songs together, the soundscapes are meticulous. The process isn't necessarily spontaneous. We develop these over time in order to produce the best work. Stephen and I knocked stuff off at a rapid rate. So as soon as we shut up talking, we wrote 2 tracks immediately.
Yeah.
One of them was an 8-minute epic called Faith's Last Doubt. Another one was a 2.5, 3-minute piece called Screaming Head Eternal. It was a kind of a post-punk funk noise. And Stephen and I just wanted to do anything we could, any way we could.
Right.
And there was a great sense of freedom. So I think at that stage, what I was writing with Plenty was probably amongst the best stuff I'd ever done. And some of it I'd still rate amongst the best stuff I'd ever done. And what I was doing with Stephen was just really exciting. But Stephen is, of course, as well as being talented, bright and very capable of learning quickly. So he, like I, knew what was special in Plenty. So we'd sometimes do Plenty covers. You know, this was odd that No Man were doing Plenty covers because we could see the craft in the pieces. And that helped us grow. And I think that really Stephen and I, for about 2 years, just threw everything. It was almost like if you're an abstract expressionist and you're throwing all the paints.
Throw all the kitchen sink in, right?
And we did everything from epics to funk to punk to a thread that came through on the Speak album, which is this kind of timeless ballad that we were always drawn to. And it was great. You know, we were both enjoying ourselves an awful lot. And the crunch time really came in 1988 when Stephen said, "I think this is special. I think we've got to take this seriously. Let's move to London." So I then presented this to Plenty, and initially what I'd said, because I'd been in Plenty for the longest time, I said, "Look, if you want to carry on with Plenty, I'll carry on with Plenty, but we have to try and make this into something serious."
Right.
At that time, we were just kind of getting local radio play and the odd review here and there.
Were you
Stephen and
gigging?
I were. Pardon?
Were you gigging at all? Were you gigging?
We did very few gigs. We did two gigs. One of them at a sixth form college that Dave was the headmaster at, which was good. And one at a famous venue in Widnes that the Beatles, I think it's called the Queen's Hall, and the Beatles have played there. Great venue. It was a Band Aid tribute. And I think we were fine, but Brian's DX, I always take this as a metaphor for what happened. Brian's DX7 broke down during the gig.
Uh-oh.
This was the portent. This was the death of the band in a way. And so that was it really gig-wise. And Stephen was very ambitious like me, really. And Brian and David at the time, they were both lecturers, and Dave, I think, was head of a college. And, they were 5-6 years older than I was,
Right.
and they didn't really want to risk that.
Right. I got you.
So I did the Dick Whittington thing and packed my bags, my little sack, and went off to London. And Stephen and I took it seriously. But, I never forgot the Plenty music. And luckily, I've reconnected with both Brian and David, and we get on well.
Did you and Steve move in together in London? Was that the deal or what?
We nearly did. There's one hilarious bit where we'd started working with Ben Coleman at this stage, our violinist.
Yeah. Now, can you explain where he came from and how you came across it? You're in London now, and then you come across Ben. Is that how that worked?
No, it's before that. So basically, Stephen and I are recording. Then in 88, Stephen saw an advert in the Melody Maker for violinists, thought it was interesting. He brought Ben into a session. Ben was fantastic. We both fell in love with his playing.
Oh, God.
I then brought in Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl, who had been in Still, the band I was in 1983. And it was great because we had two musicians who were both classically trained, but had both been perverted by jazz and pop. So they had a lot to offer. Right. And then Stephen and I, who were hugely ambitious, who dictated all of the writing. So, this was the band. And we did. And one of the first things we ever did, I think, as a band, it might have even been our second gig, actually. We entered as a joke the Hemel Hempstead Battle of the Bands. Yeah, the Hemel Hempstead Battle of the Bands.
Right.
And we entered it as a joke because we thought we were going to come last and we were just going to do whatever we wanted to do.
Right.
And Jacko Jackcheck, latterly of King Crimson and then of Level 42, was one of the judges.
That's crazy.
And we did a pretty uncompromising performance of the material.
Remember what you played? Remember
I can remember we played The Girl from Missouri, which was our standout live track.
That was your single, right? That was
our single. We released that as a single because it always went down really well live, but it was horrendous in the studio. And I think we played Bleed, which ended up on a few No Man recordings, and we definitely, let me think, we did a couple of tracks from a demo that we'd released around that time. Mouth Was Blue.
That wasn't Swagger.
Swagger, yeah. Okay. So we did. I think we did Mouth Was Blue. Life Is Elsewhere.
Love that track. Love that track.
Life Is Elsewhere is an old Plenty track that I'd written with Brian.
Okay.
Mouth Was Blue, Bleed, Life Is Elsewhere, and Girl from Missouri, I think. And with Bleed and Girl from Missouri, we delighted in the pieces descending into absolute dissonant chaos. We were on a big stage, Hemel Hempstead Pavilion, fairly big crowd, and we thought, let's just enjoy this.
Right.
And so we made a racket, and then we ended up winning it, which was great. It was the second gig we ever we did, and this led to us. And it turned out that Jacko was one of the deciding factors because he said, "Look, this is the only band that are original and that could end up doing something."
Right.
So in a sense, we owe Jacko huge thanks for that, and we got to know him very well in the early '90s when he was working with Jansen Barbieri and Khan.
Real quick question on that. So it's you're singing, Ben's playing violin, Stuart's playing guitar,
Stuart's guitar.
Steven's playing all the keyboards, right?
Yeah. For the first year of No
Who's
Man
playing
Live,
drums? No one was drumming. Was it just
no, we had program drums.
program drums?
We had backing tapes, program drums, and like Plenty at the time, we had backing tapes that ran through the gig. So when we played with Plenty, we had a reel-to-reel at the back of the stage, and No Man was very similar. So we had a reel, so people knew that the rhythms and certain sounds were coming through. And rather than talk, this is at the time when I couldn't talk to audiences. I can do it now, but we had sound effects and sounds throughout. And Plenty did this, and early No Man did this. So really, No Man developed out of a studio duo, Stephen and I writing. I brought in Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl, and he brought in Ben Coleman. We gigged a few times, and Stuart was amazing. He's from, as I've said, a classical background, but he was perverted by jazz. He can do almost anything, but his true love is actually Django Reinhardt. And I thought what he brought to our music was incredibly original, because he was bringing these arcane tunings, the harmonics to our music, but he just didn't enjoy it as much as just doing acoustic jazz with a violinist. Right. Whereas Ben loved it. Ben came from a similar background, but for him, the sheer noise, beauty, and expanse of the sound of No Man was better than where he'd come from.
Well, in those early albums, Tim, Ben has a lot of freedom to roam around in the sound, what's going on. And that's what's kind of very unique about No Man from that era, and what I would call the synth pop era. Let's take Speak out of there a little bit, because they were experiments in more atmospheric type tracks, but the stuff like Love Sighs and Love Blows, Love Blows. I'm forgetting the damn name. I apologize. Love Cries. Yeah. Ben has a lot of leeway to kind of drive those tracks in a lot of way, along with your voice. Stuff like Days in the Trees. I mean, that is still one of my absolute favorite No Man songs, because it's just so beautiful and so different from what you were hearing at that era. You know what I mean? It was just very different, and a lot of that was your voice and Ben's violin.
Think we managed to, I think what was great about No Man is that anything went. And so Stephen and I, because we wrote so much together in 87, 88, we found our sound. And I think that, it was interesting that you're right. I think we did have, partly because this can work against people, because both of us, as I hope the album years proves, have a very eclectic tastes. And I think that came through. We were drawing from so many areas, and that can cause confusion. But with No Man, it meant that we had a singular sound. And having a player as brilliant as Ben, and Ben remains one of the best musicians I've ever worked with. And I've worked with Mel Collins, I've worked with Robert Fripp, I've worked with Phil Manzanero. He's in their league. He's amazing. And I'm working with him now, actually. One thing I can give you as a scoop on this is that Ben and I are writing a piece together, which is the first time we've written a piece together in years. Right. He played on my last album, and he's still an astonishing player with an amazing tone, really, great player. And we did leave, we left. We thought that was one of the, the originality of No Man in some ways was, I think, allowing Ben's playing to flow. Yes. This was music that was controlled, but it was also spontaneous.
Yep.
And live, what happened was this, that Stuart didn't want to do what he considered to be rock music anymore. I think it was very eclectic rock music, but he didn't want to do it. And ironically, we became more of a band and more of a guitar band when Stuart left, because Stephen took over the guitar. And then for about 2 years, and it's still one of my favorite periods of No Man, especially live, it was me, Stephen, Ben, and a backing tape. Now, that might sound sterile to you, but we were on fire. We, the three of us could make one hell of a racket. And that backing tape was just where we bounced off
Right.
And Stephen and Ben were tremendous, the noise they made. And at that time, I think people don't realize, because I have a much more controlled voice in a lot of my recordings, I can bellow with the best of them live, and I'd sometimes come off No Man gigs with my throat filled with blood, it would be that loud.
Well, let's take a look real quick real quickly. Was it the Colors single, the cover that you did, that was what led you to get the recording contract, right? Or the publishing contract?
So what happened was, we were playing live in London, suddenly as a trio, and we started getting an audience. We were playing, there's a club in Wembley, and it was kind of more for electronic music. And for whatever reason, they loved us. They loved our demo. And we started, it was called The Flag, and it was in North Wembley. And we started off as 4th on the bill, went to 3rd on the bill, 2nd on the bill, headline. And then they put us on their showcases at the Marquee, the famous Marquee Club in London.
Mm-hmm.
So we were building a live audience. We were actually doing really quite kind of well, but the industry was not interested in us. So we were working it hard. We were playing lots of gigs. We were getting an audience. And I think we were producing something quite unique. And it was me, Ben, and Stephen. And then what happened was, I went back to the north of England, because I'd stayed in London for a couple of years trying to make this work.
Right.
And I went back home to Cheshire with my girlfriend at the time. And Stephen just said, look, let's just do this one recording session here. Why don't we do this Donovan track? I'd read, it was my idea, I was thinking about it. I'd read that Happy Mondays were going to record a cover of Donovan's Colours. Mentioned it to Stephen, and I said, wouldn't it be funny if we kind of beat them to it? And so basically, I went off, recorded Colours with him. It was very different vocally. It was a much more restrained performance than what had happened. Of course, the Speak recordings were restrained as well.
Right.
But we had other sides to what we did. If you listen to Mouth Was Blue, you'll know that we had other sides to what we were doing at that stage.
Oh yeah, no, I have all that stuff, Tim.
Right.
You had a much on the original Speak recordings, your voice is much more affected. You're a little bit more dramatic in your delivery. Whereas, I mean that in the best possible way. I just mean that it was, instead of where you naturally slide in now, where I hear the Tim Bowness voice.
Yeah.
I had those Speak. That was a cassette only, by the way, original issue.
Yeah.
Was that self-issued by you guys?
Yeah, it was self-issued. It's one of the ways of trying to get attention, basically. And as was Colours. So Colours, basically, we decided we were going to do it because Happy Mondays were about to do it. And I think this was the beginning, to a certain extent, of a very different vocal style for me. And it was the beginning of No Man. And what happened was, Stephen and I recorded this. It was a radical reinterpretation. It was a great showcase for Ben's amazing playing. And I'd always read the music press enthusiastically and studied who I thought might like it. This is one of the reasons why I always kind of got on local radio and got reviewed very early on. And we did Colours, and we decided to put it out in 7-inch. It was a total risk.
You're right.
And I wrote a comedy PR sheet, sent it out to 5 journalists I thought would like it. And we ended up getting Melody Maker Single of the Week and Sound Single of the Week.
Yeah.
And suddenly, from that point onwards, because we were getting people seeing us in London,
right,
but going nowhere. No one was interested.
Outside there, nobody knew about it. Yeah.
And suddenly, the next gig we did was in Manchester. And I remember it afterwards. We were at the Britannia Hotel in Manchester. And I was sitting, it's really weird. Hit and Run Music had come down to see us, who were at that time the biggest publishers in the world, independent publishers in the world. They were Genesis, owned by Genesis.
Def Leppard, all those guys, yeah.
They're big people. And they came to see us, and lots of A&R people were in the audience, and it was packed, and it was a good gig. And at the Britannia Hotel in Manchester afterwards, I was sitting there with Paul Young of Mike and the Mechanics and Sad Cafe, who'd also come to the gig because he was signed to Hit and Run. And so suddenly all of our gigs were attended by A&R, and we were getting more people as a result of this singles of the week. So, Chris Roberts in particular at Melody Maker became an early fan of the band, and I'm forever grateful to his interest and enthusiasm, because it really kick-started us getting signed to labels and publishing companies. And from that point onwards, that was it. It was music. We got signed to Hit and Run Publishing, who were most famous for Phil Collins and Genesis at that time. And we were signed in their fresh new intake. And their fresh new intake, they decided they wanted to have some young whippersnappers. So they got No Man, Right Said Fred.
Oh, jeez.
Cooler Shaker.
Oh, yeah, Cooler Shaker. I remember them.
And Space, who were a band from Liverpool, who were pretty good, actually.
Don't remember
so
them.
We were the 4 bands that were the whippersnappers that they wanted.
Wow.
And what was funny is what they weren't expecting is, because I think we might have been the youngest of the bands, actually. I mean, no, maybe Cooler Shaker. But when we went in, we were fascinated by the fact they had lots of Genesis merchandise around, because we love Genesis, you know. So it was great. And we even took the photographs. There's a great photograph in the Armando Gallo book, Genesis, the Evolution of a Rock Band, where it features Genesis with the hit and run boss, Tony Smith. And so we took the exact same photograph with No Man, with the hit and run boss, Tony Smith. But it was a really nice period. So we got signed after
So
Colours.
You got signed to One Little Indian,
changed.
right? You got signed to One Little Indian.
We were offered deals with lots of companies at the time, and we had about 5 companies, lots of majors, and we went with One Little Indian for the reason that we thought they were the most idealistic. Both of us loved a couple of artists they had on the label at the time, Kitchens of Distinction and the Sugar Cubes, which is Björk's early band. We both loved them. And we thought idealistic indie with chart success sounds good to us. And the other factor in that signing was that the Shaman got involved. For whatever reason, Stephen sent some stuff of ours to the Shaman, and the Shaman did a remix. And Colin from the Shaman came to a couple of our early gigs. You know, we used to have people, it's really nice. There were people who supported us in the early days. So Colin from the Shaman used to come to our early gigs. David Cross of King Crimson used to come to our early gigs. And even our early rehearsals. Before we were ever signed, David used to come to our rehearsals and was really, really supportive. And Colin from the Shaman came to see us, did a remix for us, and he recommended us to One Little Indian as well. And we kind of went with them because we thought they were more idealistic and would let us do what we wanted to do, because you know, we were determined to be excessive. And we were very lucky that our first couple of singles, you know, the one we released independently that I was telling you about, Colours, this Donovan cover, it's because Happy Mondays were going to record Colours, and we got there before them, if I didn't tell that story correctly. So we recorded this before they had time to record it, and ended up getting singles of the week in Sounds, Melody Maker, and very good reviews and radio play. We got playlisted on Radio 1, which is huge here.
Yeah,
BBC
that's massive.
Radio 1.
Yeah.
Were you
guys working? Were you working real jobs at that point, or had you dedicated yourself to being a musician full time? And by that I mean, you know, were you working at a record store? I never asked Steve about this when I was friends with him, and I thought he was like in IT or computers or something, like working a real day job, right? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we both were to an extent. I deliberately was doing kind of part-time work because music was what I wanted to do. So I was working for the NHS with the elderly, and I was working in a place which was specifically for the elderly, mentally and physically infirm, which means people who were very, very far gone physically and mentally. And it was, you know, it was tremendously kind of humbling and inspirational in a way, doing that sort of work. Stephen was working for McDonnell Douglas, a computer company. And but both of us just wanted to do the music. And really getting these singles of the week, our second single as well, Days in the Trees, got that. We could leave our jobs. So finally we left that, really. So I left working for the NHS, he left working for McDonnell Douglas, and we became professional musicians. And luckily, we've never stopped since. So that was it, really. And our first...
a question here. So you become full-time musicians and you're immersed in this at that point, and Ben as well too, because Ben's a pretty critical part of this. You do Love Size, which technically I've read and heard, and I want you to kind of clear this up here. Do you and Steven and Ben consider Love Size your first album, or is Love Blows your first album? Because a lot of times you see it written that and I'm going to just show these now real quick. I'll blow this up real quick. These are my personal collection here, and these are I've got two different versions of this. Why? Well, because I'm an excessive collector. This one here has both Love Size and Love Blows on it. And if you note, I want you to note this here. Can you see that, Tim? The number?
Yeah.
So allegedly, this is the the Sony Columbia version, right? Okay. Allegedly, when this came out, there was only 2,500 copies of this made. As you can see, mine says 2867. So somebody's lying. I'm not sure who, but these are the albums here where you start to, and I don't have Love Size. I have it in this package. I don't have an original. And this then comes out after all of that. Talk about this period right here in these albums specifically, if you don't mind.
Well, it was just really exciting. We got signed for the first time. So basically it was our dream come true in a way. We'd worked hard. Both Stephen and I were very ambitious. And it was funny when I did a solo gig recently, and Tony Cottrell, who was in the band still with me and Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl, came up afterwards and he said, you know what, I'd never met anybody quite as driven as you were. And I think that this is the thing, that I'd never met anyone probably quite as driven as me until I met Stephen.
Right.
And so finally we got the record contracts. We got signed to One Little Indian in the UK, and we got signed to Epic Sony in America. And basically we released a couple of singles that got singles of the week in the UK. Our gigs were going down really well. We were building up an audience, and we were allowed a lot of freedom. We were put into very expensive studios by One Little Indian, and we just recorded and recorded and recorded. And we were signed in 1990. And by 1992, we still hadn't produced our debut album.
No shit.
We were still working on it.
Yeah, right.
And so Love Size, I do not see as an album at all. It's basically, it was a mini album just collecting singles, B-sides, and material that had been on compilation albums. So that is not an album. And I think it does sound really quite ragged. Anyway, in late 1992, we finally finished our solo album, Love Size. Yeah, Love Blows and Love Cries. Love Blows and Love Cries. And it was very different. Now, I wish I had, if I had my vinyl collection, I could show you. But there are two copies of this vinyl. I've got one copy, Stephen's got the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the original version of Love Blows and Love Cries. And it's different by about 50%.
Well, I was going to say that the American version and the UK or European version,
they're different. No, it's different again.
Things are different. You've got Taking It Like a Man and Days in the Trees on the Euro version. You don't have that as on the US, and I'm assuming the title Taking It Like a Man maybe was a little sketchy for them. Maybe they were scared of what that meant. And it's sad. It's unfortunate. I have both versions, but that's why I have both versions. Now it reminded me why I do. Taking It Like a Man is one of your best songs. I fucking love that. See, I had to say it. I love that song. and Days in the Trees. You cannot have a No Man collection without Days in the Trees in it. You just can't.
Well, Days in the Trees was one of the, I mean, in fact, basically the two tracks that probably got signed along with Colours. So the Colours single meant that A&R people were seeing us. And the tracks they picked up on, Days in the Trees was one that everybody liked. And the other one was Life is Elsewhere, which was a Plenty song.
That's a great song, yeah.
We were still playing. And those were the two that basically hit and run. And One Little Indian said, this is why we want you. Right. And it was interesting. It was the classic ballad side. So anyway, we'd finished the album. And we'd gone into we went into the biggest studios in London and the UK to record it. And I don't know how many people know this, but the album was rejected. So we had the debut album. we had it ready September or October of 1992, and they wanted us to record a single. They said it's not got a single. Now, the original version had a 10-minute version of Sweetheart Raw. It had a 9-minute version of Tulip, and it had completely different studio recordings because we'd been into a few really big, luxurious studios and recorded songs. Now, you might think that the Love Blows and Love Cries that results is the compromise one where Tim and Stephen are told, no, that's uncommercial. That's rubbish.
I was going to ask that. Yeah, I was going to ask that.
But it wasn't, actually. We both prefer the one that came out afterwards because it was a bit like when I first heard, myself on the After the Stranger album, as I told you, when I first heard myself on an album on vinyl, I realized how shit I was. When I first heard Love Blows and Love Cries, I thought, you know what, we've really come on, but this isn't right. And we thought the record company were right. The album didn't hang together quite as well. As I've said, 2 copies of this album exist, I think. I've got one on vinyl.
I want to ask you something about that real quick, if I could interject. Okay, this is a later question, but I feel I got to ask it now. I've heard talk from you, I believe, that there's a No Man box set in the works. Now, are some of those tracks going to sneak on there or not? You can't talk about it.
It is happening. It's happened. We've done it. And I'm just trying to remember. I think some of them might. Yeah. Some of them might have sneaked on.
Okay, so go ahead.
So then we were basically told by the record company to rethink it. And actually, I think it was a good set. And they said, write some singles. And I think we wrote Ocean Song and Only Baby. And we then rejigged the album. And we also decided to jettison some of the big studio recordings of some of the earlier material and go with our demos. We just suddenly had the confidence. We thought, our version of this is better. And so the Love Blows and Love Cries that was released, we prefer. We thought it was a better album, despite the record company interference.
But Ocean Song didn't make it to these albums.
Didn't make it to the album, no.
It ended up on a single, right? It ended up on the, was it the B-side of Taking It Like a Man?
I think you might be right, yeah. I mean, there was some really, there's some material.
It might have been its own single now I think of it, yeah. I
mean, some great stuff.
Yeah,
Swirl, one of my favorite pieces, didn't make the album. I loved Swirl. It was always a live highlight.
So this one is kind of and I have both versions. I can't find the other one, but this is kind of like some of the tracks that didn't make those albums, correct?
Yeah, it is, yeah. And there's a lot more. There's a lot more that didn't make those albums as well. And, as I said, another B-side called Swirl, which is one of my favorites from that period. So we then released the album in 93, and we were getting brilliant press in the UK. We're getting singles of the week, very good album reviews. And we kind of hit at the time a bit Britpop. And that was really, in a sense, the unmaking of us, that while the album got good reviews and we got in the indie top 20 charts and so on, suddenly the steam went out of it, because although we were getting indie top 20, we weren't getting in the proper chart top 20. And One Little Indian were having success with Björk at that stage, and The Shaman and Skunk Anansie. And I think what happened is we kind of slipped through the cracks at that stage. That they'd invested a lot of money in us for 3 years. The album got critically great reviews, and it sold all right. It sold about 20 to 30,000, which is decent.
Sure.
But the problem is that when you're signed, you realize this. What they want are 2 things. They want an artist that sells 500 to 1,000 so they can drop them.
Yep.
They know for certain that band's never going to make it.
Right.
Or they want a band that sells 500,000.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
We were in this no man's zone. We were no man in the no man's zone.
Yeah.
And so we kind of got neglected. And on the second album, Flammoth, we recorded, and I still like Love Blows and Love Cries. I think it's a good, coherent album, and it was the album we wanted to make. And actually, record company interference made it a stronger album. But the next album, we both thought the steam's gone out of this a bit, Flammoth, in terms of record company love. Mm-hmm. Let's just make, if this is the last thing we ever do, Let's make the best album we can with the musicians we want to work with and have always wanted to work with. And let's make it as idealistic as we possibly can.
Well, let's do a tie-in here, because this is the album you're talking about right here, which is honestly one of the most beautiful and amazing albums I think has ever been created. But we got to talk a little bit about the fact that before this happens, you guys are playing live, and you in order to play live and bring the full effect of the band out, you employ 3/5 of Japan, what was once Japan. So we're talking about Mr. Barbieri, Karn, and Jansen. How did that all come together? Did you know those guys? Did they know you? How was that? I'm still curious where that all came from.
Well, this came because, Stephen and I were quite ambitious. Basically, we loved the 3-piece lineup live, but the record company felt that we should become a full band with live drums, live bass.
Right.
So we basically said to them very arrogantly, said, well, okay, this was 1991 when they said that. And we said, okay, the best albums that have been released this year, as far as we're concerned, Talk Talk's Laughing Stock and Rain Tree Crow.
God. Yes.
And we loved Rain Tree Crow and Japan, and we loved Talk Talk. And basically, because we were then signed to One Little Indian and we were signed to Hit and Run, we had people who could do it. So we partly said it out of arrogance and out of a joke. And so the next couple of gigs that we're playing, Jansen, Barbieri, and Karn are in the audience. The Talk Talk rhythm section are in the audience.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. So we kind of got almost everybody we wanted. It was great.
Right.
And Jansen, Barbieri, and Karn came to the studio when we were recording Love Blows and Love Cries. And we just kind of instantly got on, especially with Richard Barbieri. We got on with all of them.
Right.
But Richard Barbieri, in particular, just kind of felt a bit like a soulmate for me and Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Talk Talk, they were lovely. The guys, Lee and so on, they turned up to the venue, saw us. But what happened with Talk Talk is their manager came along to the gig, and he became our manager. So it was almost like a joke. We'd asked the 2 albums that we loved most at the time were the Talk Talk and the Rain Tree Crow, and we ended up being managed by Talk Talk's management and getting the Japan Rain Tree Crow rhythm section. Join us. And those gigs, musically were good. I kind of felt it wasn't the best. Weirdly enough, I'll be absolutely brutally honest. I feel we were really quite interesting and special as a trio with Ben. It was very unusual with the backing tapes. With what used to happen is we worked as a kind of almost like a fork, the prongs, and I'd be at the front. It was a very physical live performance. Ben was a great performer. And so we'd all perform. It was almost like we had 3 frontmen.
Right.
And when we'd integrated it with a band, it actually made the sound slightly more conventional, if anything. So it was good, but to me, I want
to show these young men right here. Look at that. There they are. Look at that. Look at this. Look at this guy over here. He looks like he's very, very taciturn right there, right?
Very.
And this guy right here had hair down to almost his ass at that point in time, I believe.
Well, we were I was taken by the Douglas brothers, and the Douglas brothers used to take all sorts of photographs for major people. It was great working with them, actually. And they came through Bill Smith's studio, our designers. So we got them involved, but we became friends. The good thing was we became friends. And I think the studio work that we produced with Barbieri, Jansen, and Karn was really good. So I loved the studio work we did with them. I was never as keen on the live 6-piece. In fact, weirdly enough, it was when we got the Maitland brothers, as I call them, Silas Maitland, Chris Maitland.
Right.
And
but they're not related, right? They're not related.
They're not related. No, they didn't know one another. They're not related.
Kind of weird. Where did Chris come from? Where did Chris come from? Where did Chris come from?
Audition.
Was he playing? Was he playing with Stephen at that point? I guess he was, right? No, he wasn't. Okay. Chris
and Silas Maitland. it was when we were auditioning for another band after the JBK, and Chris was great. You know, he just had a real personality as a player and as a person, lovely person.
Oh, amazing.
And Silas Maitland was quieter, but very intelligent, very assured. Really, again, lovely guy to work with, actually. And so they were our kind of replacement rhythm section after Jansen, Barbieri, and Khan. And I think we were better with them actually live. I think they kind of, I don't know why, it fitted. Yeah, it just fitted more. And so, yeah, that's how Stephen met Chris Maitland. And Colin,
so they're on this record. We should say that the JBK guys are on here, and also both the Maitlands are on here. I believe Ian Carr is on here. Robert Fripp is on here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an all-star cast of a lot of the collaborators that you will use going forward. And so do you think that Ben leaves midway through this? Okay. I don't know if he quit like during the recordings or if he after the recordings were done, but can you speak to what went on there? Was it partly because of the live thing, or just did he have some other options to move on?
Well, it was twofold, really. One, you're right, it was the live thing. Ben is an incredible player, still is.
Oh, yeah.
But we weren't playing live. Stephen and I made a potentially stupid decision. We decided that we weren't going to play live again. We were playing clubs and we were doing pretty well. You know, we were getting sold out audiences in London. But we decided we weren't going to play live until we could make the music we wanted to make. So for us, we wanted to play at 1,000-seater venues with string quartets. We were ambitious.
Aspirations, right?
Yeah, ambitious and uncompromising.
Yeah.
And of course, Ben is a brilliant live player. So suddenly the live gigs stop after 93.
Oh, okay.
And the radio sessions stop. Then I suppose what happened is that we wanted to use other instrumental voices. We wanted to hear trumpets, saxophones, and essentially Stephen and I were producing the No Man albums and we wanted certain voices. So Ben felt really left out. You know, he's an incredible player.
I see.
And what happened was basically, because the band was in effect, and always had been me and Stephen, we were giving Ben a reduced role suddenly.
Yeah.
Because there were no gigs and he wasn't featuring as much on the studio material, so he was unhappy.
Yeah.
And we made him an offer. We basically said, look, we love your playing. We think you're great. But from now on, the studio albums, if we want to use an orchestra, we'll use an orchestra. If we want to use a trumpet player, we'll use a trumpet player.
Right.
And I think it hit his ego quite badly that he wasn't the soloist and all the stuff.
Yeah.
And basically he didn't like the idea that in effect he'd almost be perceived as a session player on a lot of the stuff from that point onwards.
Yeah.
But we were still quite prepared to have him on a retainer and be in the band. And I guess it caused a lot of upset and a lot of arguments at the time. And luckily...
Well, that all came together many years later. You guys kind of reconciled all that.
Yeah, I don't think we ever, we never really fell out. Ben was very different on a personality level as well. Ben is Israeli, and he was very different from myself and Stephen. Stephen and I are fanatics when it comes to music, film, literature. And we can both talk for England, and we're both probably, quite sensitive in a way. Ben is much more forthright Israeli. He's nowhere near as obsessed with the details as we are, and so on. But he's an amazing player, still one of the best musicians I've ever worked with, and am working with now. It then became the duo, and if anything, it sort of freed us, because we were back to Stephen and I as we were when we first met one another, just writing, playing, throwing any idea into the mix. And that's how Wild Opera and Dry Cleaning Ray came about. That we were just kind of freed from genre, freed from expectation, freed from having to use Ben in every song.
Yes, I see.
Because that's the problem. Ben is a brilliant musician, still one of the best
But if
I've
he's
ever
not
worked
being
with.
used, he's kind of immaterial to the music then at that point. Yeah.
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 And it was an insult to him. It was an insult to him as well that we weren't using a player of that ability. But the two of us wanted to use trumpets, saxophones, samples.
Yep. You just wanted to expand the music to every dimension you could include. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's real quick talk about a couple quick things here. The artwork by Carl Glover, very important element, I think, in No Man. His work can't be understated. Talk about that a little bit, and also with regards to the Flower Mix album that comes out after Flower Mouth. There's a lot of reinterpretations of songs on here that are radically different.
Yeah.
Tell me which, if you had to pick a favorite out of Flower Mix, let me know one or two favorites. And I know that's like picking your children, so I get that. But for me, Born Simple is just, man, that's good stuff. So
yeah. Well, I suppose that would be one. If I had on the remix album, I suppose Born Simple, I think really has a great level of intensity that builds. I think it was. I'm not sure whether it was called Witching Ovaries. I'm not sure whether that is one of my favorites or not. There's one that basically became Only Rain. That I did with David Costin. I had an idea for a remix, and David Costin of Faultline, who I was working with at that time, I suggested what it would sound like, and so he helped me realize that.
I think Heal the Madness is the samples.
Is that the one that comes out of?
Yeah, it's got the beautiful strings that you use at the beginning of.
So that became Only Rain as well. Yeah. That developed into Only Rain.
Yeah.
And I really like the Angel Dust as well. I think that works very nicely. But and probably Born Simple. I think Born Simple. I just think the intensity, the overwhelming intensity.
Well, it's sinister. It's a sinister sounding. As it builds, it just gets sinister sounding. Man, there's a killer guitar in there. It's really evil sounding. I love it.
As you can imagine, it was a thrill for us to work with people like Robert Fripp. And
it's like it's like your metal song for these albums. It's like your heavy metal song. Talk about Carl Glover real quick. What
well, Carl came with basically One Little Indian were co-owned by Derek Burkitt, another partner, and somebody who was a sleeve designer, and he was great. He was really good and a lovely guy, and he had a very distinctive style, and he worked with me on the first couple of sleeves, Love Blows and Love Cries and Love Sighs. But he wasn't really my first choice of who I'd like to work with. And One Little Indian fell out with him. Although he was a partner in the company and a director, he fell out with the company, and suddenly we were free to use whoever we wanted. And I'd seen the Bill Smith studio artwork for King Crimson. I think it was the King Crimson box set, frame by frame, that I thought was incredible. And I found out who it was, and it turned out that Carl Glover was the main person creating this work. Mm-hmm. So while we got to work with Carl Glover at Bill Smith's studio, and it was our choice. We loved what he was doing elsewhere, and it was the King Crimson frame by frame box set that had been the point of entry for us. And the idea for Flower Mouth was one I had. The actual cover itself was an image I had in my head. And it was kind of fantastic to have people of the ability of Carl and Bill Smith and the Douglas brothers coming together to produce this work.
Right.
And Stephen and I got very close to Carl, basically. So eventually, after a few years, we used Bill Smith's studio. I think Bill became slightly less interested in us after this album, because this album had a big budget. One Little Indian was still pumping lots of money into us.
Do you know, can you say how much, or is that something you want to discuss?
Do you know what? I can't. I mean, in my mind, I've got something that the combined amount we were getting from, because we were signed to Epic in America, mm-hmm. we were signed to Nippon Columbia in Japan. So, you probably are talking well over 100,000
wow.
plus we're getting money to go into the most expensive studios in Britain. Although with Flowermouth, what we did was this. Because we thought it might be the last album, we decided to make it the most idealistic, and we bought our home studio. We basically, so this is how everything started. But we bought the best equipment we could.
So this is how No Man's Land became No Man's Land.
This is how No Man's Land properly became No Man's Land, because we thought if we get dropped after this album, at least we're going to have a great studio.
Exactly. Right.
So. Yeah, Carl came in, as I said, through his work with Bill Smith Studio. And when he left Bill Smith Studio, he stuck with us, and now he's got his own company. And he's, Carl is great because as well as being quite visionary, he's very friendly, very approachable, very playful. And we've continued to work with him on various projects. So that kind of tells you how much
we should mention his company is called Aleph, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are kind of companion pieces, Wild Opera and Dry Cleaning Ray. And these are, these are some of your most interesting, if not your most interesting pieces of work, because as you said, they're very diverse. They're kind of all over the place. And a track I really wanted to ask you about was Punished for Being Born. So that is a track that I think, is it Brian or Bryn? Bryn. So Bryn Jones remixed that track. And for those that don't know who Bryn Jones is, he was Muslim Gauze. And I mean, if you want to try to be a completist in Muslim Gauze, good luck, because it's probably never going to happen. There's, I don't know, maybe 200-300 releases that he put out during his lifetime. Sadly, he passed quite a while ago of I don't remember what it was. Did he get some kind of lung infection or something like that?
It was, yes, sepsis? I think it was. Was it sepsis? I'm not sure.
I think it might have been sepsis.
It might be pneumonia, but
pneumonia. Yeah. So was that brought about as a result of Stephen working with him for the bass communion stuff that he was doing at that time, or was it? Did he? Because I know they didn't really know each other. They kind of connected on that, and then I'm assuming Stephen asked him to do this piece for you. Did you ever actually meet him, or did he ever?
No, we didn't. I think Stephen spoke to him on the phone. Yeah, when we got the remixes in for Flower Mix, we both put names. So, David Costin, Faultline, he came in through me. And of course, David's co-produced some of Stephen's work recently. Bryn came in through Stephen. So they were coming in through both of us, bringing in ideas of who we'd like to remix our material. The Heaven Taste and Flower Mix albums, in a way, they were like place fillers. Because One Little Indian were happy to keep us on board, but Flowermouth did quite well. It sold more than the first album, actually. And especially abroad, it sold more than the first album. But we were selling about kind of 30,000, which to them was nothing, because they were selling, 250,000 minimum with some of their other artists.
Right.
And then they were selling, as I've said, 500 with other artists. So we were a real conundrum to them, that we sat in the middle.
Right.
And basically they said to us, we'll keep you on, but you're not going to have the advance or the support that you had. Plus, they were wanting us to go in a more commercial direction. The story I've not said is that Flowermouth we did as idealistically as we possibly could. And we had budget for a video, a big video with Michael Benyon.
Oh, okay.
And that video he then used for a television campaign that became very successful, the video idea. And on the day the single we were going to do, they said, no, this is uncommercial. So they'd heard the album, and we started off with a 10-minute semi-ambient piece, Angel Gets Caught in the Beauty Trap. And as soon as they heard that, their faces dropped, and the budget for promotion went.
Oh, really?
And ironically, the album sold more because good word of mouth and us suddenly selling in places like Italy, Poland. It changed. And really, it was both the death of the band and the making of the band. And they just said, look, we'll keep you on, but, because we were selling enough to be still interesting to them. but the budget would go, and I think they were going to try and force us into more commercial directions.
So,
So
wait, when you said they were going to keep you, do you mean for distribution?
no, signed. You know,
Oh,
they'd
would you
sign us.
sign? But you weren't going to get any money.
Yeah, we'd get money. We'd get money, but we'd get considerably less than
Oh,
we
okay,
would
not
have
the
done.
not the big budget
Yeah,
stuff.
not the
Okay,
big budgets.
so you guys decide, well, fuck you then. We're going to go make Wild Opera and Dry Cleaning Ray, and they're completely like, the great thing about those two albums is that no two tracks are remotely in the same kind of genres. They're all over the map. You've got
it was an amazing period. Well, how that started was we were doing a much more logical follow up to Flowermouth, because Flowermouth I still love.
Oh, it's
and
beautiful.
We'd written pieces like Lighthouse, you know, the beginnings of Lighthouse.
Okay.
And we were working on a more obvious, logical follow up to Flowermouth that was going to be very ambitious, bits of which ended up on Returning Jesus.
Returning Jesus, right. Okay.
But we just went off. We just kind of went off on the Wild Opera Dry Cleaning Ray experiments. And it was great fun. It was a real period of growth for us, and a real period of experimentation.
How do you look back on those albums now with perspective? I mean, I still think that there's some of the most interesting things that you guys have done. I wouldn't say they're my favorite, but there's something about them that's so unique. They're just very unique albums. I mean, how do you feel about them now when you...
Pretty much what you're saying. They're not my favorites, but I remember it being an exciting period, a real period of discovery. It was great fun. I mean, it was a bit worrying for me. I mean, because this question you've not come on to, but the Porcupine Tree question was, Stephen finally was kind of, because we decided not to play live, he started playing live with Porcupine Tree.
Right.
It was the early days of that. And we'd suddenly decided, our choice, we'd opted out of our label deal with One Glintian because the support wasn't going to be as great as it was.
Okay.
And so it was more, slightly more financially precarious. And Stephen was writing music for adverts at that point as well. It's one of the ways he was keeping afloat.
Right.
And it was a very unusual time. So this music was happening as the dream of No Man being big was unraveling in a way. But we loved creating it, and we'd abandoned what was going to be a more logical follow-up to Flowermouth, and we immersed ourselves in what became Dry Cleaning Ray and Wild Opera. And it was lovely, creatively, it was a really nice, free-flowing period, and we were very productive.
So then you actually go, I don't know where this falls in I hate to admit this, where does this fall in the, this is the Dry Cleaning Wild Opera period, right?
Yeah. That's the first single from Wild Opera. I think that's probably 95, I'm guessing.
But Housewives wasn't actually on the album, though, was it? I don't think it was.
I can't remember. I thought it was, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, oh, it is. It is. Yeah. Okay. My bad. Love that song. What a cool song. What a crazy ass title for a song, though. I mean, it's just so cool. What was your thinking there? Just the nuttiness of it, or the craziness of it?
Anything. Well, I think when we were doing the Wild Opera sessions, anything went. We were writing with no ideas. It was like we just kind of came in and we gave ourselves an hour to write, record, and complete something. And some of it was what ended up on the album. Some of it we might have developed that little bit further
later down. Okay. Well, let's talk about this one quick here. We're getting to we'll get out of the No Man stuff here soon, but you have this album, which is all old stuff, except for this comes out on Materiali Sonori in 99 as kind of a bridge album to Returning Jesus, which I think a lot of people probably regard that and Flowermouth as your two greatest works. I don't know that I fully agree. I know this one's way up there for me. It's just such a beautiful, amazing album. Different track listings. The Italian version has a couple tracks that aren't on the reissue from Snapper, and also vary quite a bit. Somewhat from the cassette version, but you re-record your vocals on these. Now, Tell us why you did that.
I think I re-recorded it because we realized that the material was good and we realized it had a timeless quality. But my voice at that time, I think I always kind of described it as being like some kind of constipated buffalo. I think that, I was suffering from 80s-itis at that point.
A little bit.
And I think that by the time it came to the 90s, I'd established my own voice. And I was responding to the material. So we just kind of did it. And we did it very spontaneously. We did it in the spirit of the original material, because this original material we'd written spontaneously. When I used to get together with Stephen, we'd write anywhere between 3 and 5 pieces every session that we do, every day.
That's insane.
So,
that's crazy.
Well, if I spent a weekend with him, we might end up with 10 pieces at the end of it.
Amazing.
And so we wanted it to be as spontaneous as possible. So we baked the tapes, got the tapes out. And I just recorded all the vocals for that album probably in about 3 or 4 hours, because we wanted it to have the spontaneity that the originals did, but maybe with a more timeless quality, which we felt my 1999 voice had, which my 1987 voice didn't.
Yeah.
And it was a great, I love that album because I think it's something quite timeless about it. I mean, and it's a bit like with the 2 albums you brought up, Flower Mix and Heaven Taste. It was a bit of an interim album, really. Mm-hmm. But it's an interim album I really loved. And the reason for all those interim albums, the first 2 were released on voice print, and we sold out of all of them really quickly, which was very nice. It was very encouraging. It was our first thing outside of One Little Indian. And we were really kind of pleased that we just kind of pressed a few thousand, and those few thousand sold out in a few months. And, it's kind of an interesting period for us, really. And of course, Porcupine Tree were growing.
Of course they were. That was the other side of this thing. Stephen's not only writing for No Man, but he's also writing for his quote unquote solo project that then becomes a full band. And their profile is starting to rise quite rapidly from this period on, 99, 90. Well, actually, probably a little earlier than that, Signify on. It started to accelerate because that's when Barbieri joins the band, and you've got Colin Edwin joining the band, and then Chris Maitland. Talk about this, the Hidden Art of Man Ray. When was this done, and what was the thinking behind that? Because it's a really weird track.
Hidden Art of Man Ray was a kind of improvised soundtrack that we did to a friend's film. And that includes Stuart Blagden, the Still Owl. It includes Ben Coleman. And it was mostly improvised. So it was our improvised soundtrack to a film, because we did a couple of gigs like that, improvised soundtracks to films, and that captures that side of what we did. And that was the name of the film, The Hidden Art of Man Ray.
Ah, okay. Let's see. The Hidden, the Night Sky, Sweet Earth. What an amazingly beautiful track.
That has got a great Genesis story, actually, because that was Stephen and I went on a writing holiday. This was 1989, and it was before we got signed. And we just decided to go to Devon, and we wrote some pieces. Probably about 3 or 4, and 2 of them I don't think have ever been released, and they're good. And I think Stephen's only very recently found them on his tape drives. But one of them, Night Sky Sweet Earth, we kind of wrote this. Stephen got his acoustic guitar, and there's a place in Devon called Ilfracombe. So we were in a holiday home, but then we went to this place where there's basically a rock. And it's a rock that overlooks the roaring Southwest Sea.
Wow.
And Stephen and I wrote that almost in real time while outside a church on a rock looking into the wild sea.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's so cool.
And it was great. It was a lovely experience to write, and I really liked the song.
It's a beautiful, beautiful song. And I mean, as all the tracks are on that album, I mean, there's some really funny titles on here, like Iris Murdoch, Cut Me Down, and you've got French Tree Terror Suspect, which Monty Python, little Python-esque there, maybe?
Well, it is Python, but basically that came because I went through a phase of, I don't know how, completely misreading headlines.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw this thing, French tree terror suspect, and it was French free terror suspect.
Okay, that makes a little more sense there. So that comes out in '99, and then you're already creating material for this album, and this is the single for Carolina Skeletons, which has one of my favorite No Man songs, "Something Falls." What a beautiful song on there. That did not make it on the album, but talk
No.
about this album a little bit. Again, you've got all kind of contributors. Colin Edwin, is Chris Maitland on this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ian Dixon, Rick Edwards, Dave Costin, Theo Travis, who becomes a big contributor and actually goes out with Steven on his solo tours. You've got, you got Steve Jansen on drums. I mean, just another all-star record. And this is my favorite album by you guys. I love everything, as you know, probably, as you can tell how invested I am in it. But this particular album is just, there's something ridiculously special about it. This is your laughing stock. And yes, it's hard to not make the comparisons to that band. And I don't think you or Steve would ever shy away from admitting that how much influence, bands like Talk, Bark Psychosis, maybe a little bit, how much they had on your direction. Not that you ripped them off, but that it just helped shape where you were going.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Talk, Bark Psychosis, Rain Tree Crow, Japan were huge influences for both of us. And we also, listened to a lot of experimental jazz and classical music. And I think what happened with Returning Jesus is, I mean, I loved the process, actually. I really like Wild Opera. I really like Dry Cleaning Ray. And what we tend to do is we tend to just kind of contradict one another with the next project. So the next project, we suddenly decided that after doing things that were spontaneous, where we'd given ourselves an hour to write, record, complete something, we just thought, okay, if this is the last thing we do, it's a bit like with Flowermouth. It was the same attitude we had with Flowermouth. If this is the last thing we do, let's make it as meaningful and as good as we can. And in fact, that was recorded probably during my worst period. Kind of financially, it was a very difficult period for me. And I was I was kind of living, not quite from hand to mouth, but I was living from place to place. It was, but I wanted to make a very lasting statement, if that makes sense. From all of this chaos and all of this moving from place to place, I wanted something meaningful and lasting to come out of it. And that's really what Returning Jesus came out of for me personally. And again, a bit like Flowermouth, it was a real turning point for us, because once we'd made it, suddenly the music started selling again. Suddenly people were really getting quite interested in what we did, because what we've not discussed is that when Wild Opera and Dry Cleaning Ray came out, got a few good reviews, especially in foreign papers. Like in Ireland, we were getting album of the month and single of the month in places like Hot Press. But suddenly we were no longer fashionable in Britain, and we weren't Britpop, and we weren't grunge, and we weren't anything. We weren't jungle or drum and bass. And so we were just kind of falling in between stools and getting ignored. But in foreign countries, we were still getting some great reviews, Italy, Ireland, and so on. But this was just meant to be a kind of a lasting statement that if this is the last album we make, let's make it as good as we possibly can, which was the attitude we went into Flowermouth with.
I was just going to say, you've made that statement a couple of times. So I think pretty much every album you go in, you guys say to yourself, hey, if this is the last album we make, let's just make it as good as we can, right?
To an extent, yes, except Wild Opera, Dry Cleaning Ray, that we went in with just kind of anything goes.
Right.
We weren't thinking about legacy.
Right.
That. And
so this album just has so many incredibly beautiful songs on it. It's very minimalist for the most part. There's not a lot of, it's a lot of space in the songs. And of course, because Steve's mixing it, his ear is just almost undeniably otherworldly, the way he hears mixes and whatnot and the sounds. And you got tracks like Slow It All Down. Your vocals on that song, Tim, they rip through my core when I listen to that song. It's so gorgeous. It's such a beautiful song. But every song on here, you're vulnerable on every song here. And you're vulnerable. That's if anyone said, well, how would you explain Tim's vocals? The first word that comes to my mind is vulnerable, ethereal, breathy. And you've heard all these things, and I'm sure you're sick of hearing them, but evocative, emotional. This is an emotionally deep album for me. When I listen to it, it brings me to the verge of tears, some of these songs, because they're so beautiful. So thank you for that, first of all. But just an amazing album. Anybody that doesn't know No Man, just go get this album, man. It is so fucking good. See, my second F word there. Sorry. I've been very good. I've been actually very restrained. Also, during this period of time, you start a company, and we're going to get to that in a minute. Burning Shed, you start an online distribution company, which essentially at first you started to just distribute CDRs, ready or made to order CDRs when people would order stuff in. And it was of, No Man and Base Communion and mostly your projects and other Pete Morgan, who is a musician and friend of yours. I always thought it was Pete Chilvers that you started the company with until I did some reading recently. And so you started that, and then you put out this Lost Songs, which has 14 amazing songs that didn't find homes anywhere or are different variations of pre-existing songs. A couple on here that kill are Goth Girl Killer. That's a killer one. And Love Among the White Trash is amazing. Coming Through Slaughter. I mean, this is an essential album, but it's kind of your cutout bin, if you will, almost in a weird way. Anything to say about this here?
Well, Stephen and I were always very productive. Speak probably represents about half of what we did during that time. That stuff probably represents about a third of what we did during that time. So we always wrote. And the stuff that I'm less embarrassed about now, some of the very, very early stuff like Screaming Head Eternal. And when I hear it, it's quite passionate. It's quite interesting, which has never ended up on any official No Man release. I mean, it was a good period. Basically, I had an idea for a label. Peter Chilvers also got involved around this time, and he thought it was a great idea for a label. And it partly came out of No Man mail order, because No Man, when we were signed, we used to release CDR. So we'd release an official album through One Little Indian or through Adasam, as they became known. And then we'd release a cassette of something like radio sessions or demos or what have you through our personal address. And then we started getting into CDRs, and that was material like Lost Songs as well. Mm-hmm. And we built up about really 4,000 people on the mailing list, out of which 2,000 plus would buy. We had a remarkably high percentage of people. So who would buy? Well, thank you very much.
I got a bunch of that stuff, trust me.
And then when I was with Burning Shed, we had this idea of a kind of online, on-demand CDR label. And it was partly an idea for that label that I had, and partly coming out of the No Man mail order. And initially it started out with a Base Communion release, I think, a Tim Bowness, Samuel Smiles thing that we'd recorded live in a major studio, and a Rogerino release. Roger I'd become friends with in Norfolk, where I was living at that time. And it basically was a tiny CDR cutting room in Pete Morgan's Noisebox Enterprise. And Pete Morgan comes into the story because he supported No Man a couple of times in 1991. And we just became friends. We got on immediately. And on the second gig, he'd actually sampled the No Man track. So Stephen and I went over to him joking, saying we're going to sue him, so that's partly how we became friends.
Right. Nice.
And it was a cupboard in his other business, Noisebox.
Right.
And probably within about 5 years, Noisebox was a cupboard within Burning Shed.
Burning Shed, yeah, right. And you've expanded to this point now. You've got major bands like Jethro Tull and XTC and Andy Partridge and Tangerine Dream and all these, it's this is not a small thing anymore. It's a
No.
considerable business at this point. And you were the thing I think that's important to note here is this was very early on in the days of the internet. We're talking 2001, right? Is that about
Yeah.
when it?
I mean, I tried to get it started in 1999, but the banks wouldn't listen. We couldn't get an account, and it was only in 2001 it all came together that they decided to risk it. And of course, it was successful from the off. I mean, I knew it was a great idea, and it started with online on-demand CDRs. And the idea was it was experimental music that people like me, Stephen, and say Roger Eno or whoever couldn't get released by their labels.
Right.
And very quickly, we thought we'd created a template where if we sold 10, we'd be breaking even.
Right.
And we were selling immediately hundreds.
Yeah. So you were making good money. You're making good money then at that point. Yeah. You mentioned a band that that you had on the label, or you have on the label, although I think they're just downloads now at this point, which is a bummer because I would love a real copy of this. I have a burn somebody sent me. I want to try to find, bear with me a sec here. I don't have it noted, so I got to dig to find it. Where are you? There it is. So this is a band that you created with, I believe, Mike Bearpark. Was Chilvers. Pete was in this, I believe.
Yeah.
And Andy, was Andy in this?
No.
Okay, who else is in the band? Just so I know it.
There's a guy called Mike who was on sax, Mike Clifford.
Okay.
He was saxophone, flute.
I think you only really put out one album, correct? There was a live album, or is there a second album now?
No, there's that, and there's a live album that was limited that was released after that one, and that basically started during the time I was in No Man. And when No Man were playing live, we were playing to a lot of tapes, and we were playing with more rigid arrangements. And so Michael I'd worked with, as you know, from the days of Plenty and even earlier after The Stranger. And he'd met Peter at university and said, "You've got to hear him. He's fantastic." And I love what Peter was doing. And so Michael, Peter, and it was just fun. So I was signed to One Little Indian and Epic and Sony Columbia with No Man. But then on the side, I'd just be going down to Cambridge and kind of improvising some tunes with Michael and Peter. And it was just fun, really. We did a few gigs at bars in Cambridge University, and it was mainly just to see how many people we could annoy, I think. And we also ended up getting a BBC Radio 2 session as well, which was bizarre.
This is a really stunning album, though, Tim. I really think some of your best vocals are on this album. I mean, Dreaming of Babylon is just such a beautiful song.
Thank you.
All the what is the other big one on here that I'm blanking on the name of the song, darn it. World of Bright Futures. Yeah. Just amazing album, man. I this is one I go back to all the time, and I don't. It's interesting that was just kind of a something to do project for you. It wasn't really like, because you had the No Man thing going, you weren't really.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we were doing over the years. I mean, that album was a concentrated one where we spent time. We decided we're going to do this, and we recorded it. I remember at Peter's home studio. We recorded some stuff, as I said, very early stuff. In about 1991, we recorded in a major studio in Liverpool. And what was interesting about that is that the engineer, Ken, went on to produce Coldplay. And he'd never worked in this way before, where we went into a major studio and we booked a few hours and we just improvised. We partly improvised, but we partly did one set of recordings. This was like the old jazz albums. We thought, let's go in and do what the old jazz albums do. Get the best sound you can, record it in 1, 2, or 3 takes live. And he'd never worked like that. And strangely enough, he did work like that with Coldplay later on. It was the first time he'd ever done that. Ken Nelson, I think his name was. And it was a lovely studio in Liverpool. And that was the first stuff we ever did. And that was the first CDR that we released on
Oh,
Burning Shed. But we never released that at the time. I think we recorded it in 91 actually, but didn't release it till 2001.
oh wow.
So yeah, it was a project in between what I was doing with Stephen, because of course at that time
Right.
we'd have been doing Carolina Skeletons, we'd have been writing the material that became Returning Jesus, and it was fantastic. Once Burning Shed had been established, it was a real positive, because I think we got in quite early for this, and very, very early we became No Man's official store, Porcupine Tree's official store.
Yep.
And this then led to other people coming to us. So it's always grown very, very organically, with people coming to Burning Shed. And then me occasionally approaching people who I was working with. And I think because we got in there quite early, really, it
Very much so. Yeah. You were, I mean, you were one of the very
thrived.
first like online distros, they call them now. But so we're up to this album, and you're working on this after Returning Jesus. And I don't know how you guys do it, but you just there's something about your chemistry, the two of you together, that just creates these unbelievably emotionally heavy albums. And this is kind of, I guess you would call, maybe a lot of people call it your breakup album, but this album is just so damn beautiful. I hadn't listened to this in a bunch of years, just because it was so heavy. It's just it's an amazing album. It's right there with Returning Jesus and Flower Mouth. Like, what's happening here? Was this based on anything real, or was this just sort of?
Yeah, to an extent it was. Yeah, I mean, Returning Jesus was created during quite a turbulent time, but I think it's a really solid statement. And we were delighted. I think by this time things are kind of a lot more stable, in the sense that Burning Shed has pretty immediately become a successful company. No Man, possibly partly because of Porcupine Tree and partly because of the quality of the releases, is finding an audience again. And we produced that in a spirit of enthusiasm, although it did mark, for me, it was the end of a very long-term relationship, and all of the feelings that entails, and the stories that produces. And it was a great, despite the miserable subject matter, it was a lovely album to make, really. Yeah. And I think that because Returning Jesus had been a success, we also felt free that we could do anything. And so, this is a really uncommercial album with no focus other than its own emotions, really. So it was a lovely album to make, and it was great that it kind of went down even better than Returning Jesus, and it sold well.
No kidding.
Yeah, we signed in effect to Snapper, which is the label that we still release stuff through. So things had stabilized in that respect, and it sold well. It was shockingly well, given how uncommercial the album is.
Oh, it is very, but it's on par with, and at times it even surpasses Returning Jesus. There's some intensely emotional heaviness on this album that just tears your guts out in a lot of ways. I mean, some of the lines in we didn't talk about your lyrical thing yet. So how are you doing right now? Are you
fading, or? Yeah. No, I'm always failing, but
no, fading.
Fading. Yeah.
Do you have about an hour left in you, or no?
I could probably do some more. Yeah.
Okay. Well, because I'm getting to the end of that, and I want to get into your solo stuff. I don't know if we'll get as granular on that, but we'll try to, because I really wanted to focus on No Man today. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should have done a second part, but I don't know how much time that I might be able to do that in the future. So, but I had a question, or not a question, but I wanted to read some lyrics here that you're a very astute student of feelings and your surroundings. The way that you write lyrics, they're not Neil Peart introspective, really deep. They're kind of, this is what I see and this is what I feel. Am I simplifying that, or is that like
difficult. Yeah, I'm sure. Possibly, yeah.
like on all sweet things, which we haven't
Yeah.
talked about album yet, but the rundown streets, the civil wars, you don't go there anymore. It's how we used to live. The trampled hopes, the made up laws, the itchy feet, the pub quiz bores. It's so hard to forgive. It's just you're kind of encompassing what's going on in your world, and you're so astute at that. Like, talk a little bit about what inspires you as far as lyrically to write, let's say, for No Man versus perhaps your solo stuff. Is it a continuation, do you see, or is it just a time and place thing?
Well, there's time and place, definitely. I think, I always read. So, poetry I've always read, novels I've always read. And a lot of lyrics can come from emotional situations that I've experienced or observed. And so, the writing side of things has always been quite important. As I think, going back to something very early in the conversation with, I think I said to you that I loved a collection of the Mersey poets. I possibly mentioned that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It was a book that my mother had given me, and I remember just absolutely falling in love with it. And that probably started my love of poetry. So, I used to read a lot in the same way that I listened to a lot, and I watched a lot of films, and I had the freedom to do that. It was both a miserable time and a great time when I was an adolescent, because I could do what the hell I wanted. And yeah, obviously lyrics have always been an important thing for me. I used to write poetry, but now I don't, because the lyrics take care of that side of things.
Yeah, I think your lyrics kind of have a real prose-like, the way you write them. They're very prose-like, I guess, is the best way to describe them. But they're really great because they're kind of a human condition sort of thing, mirror. Every time I read and I'm not a real big lyric guy these days. As I get older, I kind of pay less attention to them, and I probably should, but it's just the way it is. We talk about it backstage. My ADHD kicks in sometimes, and I'm in the song at the moment, but I don't really often connect. But I just connect with your lyrics a lot. Question on these two here. So we have this in 2003. It is, I'm sorry, 2000. Is that right? No.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, 2003.
Yeah, 2003. And then there's this, which doesn't come out until 2008, which is Schoolyard Ghosts. And this was, for a very long time, the very last No Man album that came out.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons, we have some outside forces changing the dynamics of the band, because you now have Steven's career with Porcupine Tree really accelerating. And does that start to become really challenging to find time to work with him, as far as getting him out of the Porcupine Tree headspace and getting him into the No Man headspace? Because let's face it, the PT headspace is a little bit more at this point in time is a little more metal based. It's a little more proggy based. It's a lot less. It's more linear, let's say.
Yeah.
Whereas No Man is a lot more experimental, moving around. Are you having trouble finding time to get Steven to commit to No Man at this point?
Yeah, no, definitely. Porcupine Tree was taking off in a big way at that stage. But luckily I had Burning Shed, and I was also writing a lot with either myself or with other people during that time. So it wasn't a creative dead space. And I kind of always knew that we'd come together to record. But Schoolyard Ghosts probably is the most different No Man album. A lot of people probably don't know the genesis of this album, but everything else with No Man, I would say, was 100% collaborative, with really, myself and Stephen as the figureheads of that.
Right.
And I think that Schoolyard Ghosts came together because of my doggedness, probably. I think I was kind of pushing it.
I kind of had that feeling. Yeah, it was more of your drive to get something made.
Because Stephen didn't need to make it. He really didn't need to make it.
Right.
And Porcupine Tree was taking off, and in some ways it was almost a kind of a distraction. And it was also the least happy album. So that material basically came almost exclusively from my side. Either I'd written it or I'd co-written it, and Stephen was acting as co-producer with me on it. But inevitably, as it's Stephen, and inevitably as it's No Man, suddenly he's getting really interested as we're writing. So he's adding things, he's collaboration. So it did become a much more collaborative process, especially a track like True North, which started off with a solo demo of mine. And I knew this could be the beginning of something special. And it took me 4 times to persuade Stephen that this was going to be something special. And in the end, it was almost like, oh, damn it. And then once we worked on it, we both loved it.
He relented and gave in.
But it started off the first 3 or 4 minutes is just a solo demo that I'd brought in of something I'd written. And a lot of the tracks started that way and it ended. So what was interesting about that album is the album, in effect, was songs that I'd either written and brought in that then Stephen was looking at, or that I'd co-written and brought in. The exception to that was Wherever There Is Light. And we just had done the session. And it wasn't how it's funny. I don't know what it was. I think Stephen was kind of burnt out with touring and his headspace wasn't as in it. So in some ways it was the least friendly No Man session, because all the No Man sessions, I've got to say, have been huge fun. And this includes everything we've done since. So it was all great fun. This one wasn't really, but it ended being great fun. So the album was coming together, and I think we both thought, actually, yeah, this really is quite special. We both were really connecting on it. And we did Wherever There Was Light, and it took us 3 minutes to write. Stephen just came up with something, then I came up with something.
Wow.
And it was done. And so the session ended in a really positive way with us just writing. And I think, in fact, that's probably how it started, where we might have said, oh, I know, let's write something like we used to do on Speak and with Wild Opera. And within half an hour, we'd written Wherever There Is Light, which is one of my favorite No Man pieces. And that was 100% collaborative.
Beautiful song. Well, okay, so I wanted to mention one thing when I brought up lyrics from the last album, Back When You Were Beautiful, which actually is probably one of my favorite No Man songs. It's just, oh, man, it makes me almost want to cry right now. It's just such a beautiful song. The lyrics, singing songs they'll never understand, tempo drifts in half-cut wonderlands. Back when you were beautiful, they'd smile and shake your hand. And then my favorite Tim line ever right here. Friendship comes, but it mostly goes. Man, dude, that line is so real. It's the reality of the human condition, because friendships often come, but they do go. And that's a heartbreaking thing, because that connectivity to human beings that you, whether it's a male or a female or whoever, there's something very special about that, because you don't, in your life, you don't have that many really meaningful relationships, right? And that line always just makes me tear up, man. It's so damn good. I love that lyric. Thank you for that.
Well, that was written when I was living in New York briefly for about 3 months in Manhattan, and Giancarlo Era came over to Manhattan, and so that was one of the pieces. We wrote a couple of pieces during that time, and it's certainly one of my favorites as well.
It's just beautiful. But I think we need to mention real quick here, in between here, when you can either make some comments or we can move on, but I forgot to show that in between that period, there was, and I had these in order, but somehow they became jumbled. So my apologies for that. Here we go. This is your first solo album, which came out in 2004. And interestingly enough, I had always thought that Stephen put his solo album first out, but that's not the way it was. You actually beat him by several years, actually.
Yeah, I don't consider this to be a solo album. It's funny. I know it's my solo album and I was in control of it.
Right.
But what that was a means of me gathering together about 3 or 4 writing projects. I was writing with a lot of different people, including Hugh Hopper, who'd been with Soft Machine famously.
Right.
And nothing was kind of going anywhere. And so that album is a way of making it work. It was almost... I don't know, hammering disparate projects together.
Mhm.
And I worked with a drummer and producer called David Picking on that, and he was great. I mean, he's a really good drummer, really good producer, and I think he's got a coherent sound primarily because of him, but I don't think the material was I mean, for me personally, it was not the strongest, and I was kind of unhappy with that when it was released as well, although I think it's got some good stuff on it. And
yeah, it's probably, I'll be honest with you, it's probably my least favorite of your solo albums. It's just not because it sounds disparate like you're saying. It's just not, there aren't as many memorable songs on it, I think.
Well, one of the weird things about it, I think it's also the feel that Together with Stranger, Return to Jesus sound really complete. This one, to me, even though it was made during quite a happy time, this was not an unhappy time.
Mm-hmm.
Sounded dead, sounded miserable.
Yeah, it's kind of flat. That's a good.
Yeah, it's really flat, and I don't know why. I really don't know why, because albums like Returning Jesus that were produced during a terrible time,
right,
sound great to me.
Amazing. Yeah.
And Schoolyard Ghosts actually was probably the most miserable No Man album to put together. Although it ended it ended in a really
you said it
positive
ended
way.
Positively, yeah.
And I think we both really loved the album, but it wasn't. That's the least enjoyable No Man project. But I think the album, I love it.
We kind of skipped two albums here real quick that you can just make quick comments on. This one here would be, and this is a very beautiful album that you did with Pete Chilvers. I own this. I couldn't find it, but man, this is a really Tim Bowness album, but it's a lot of beautiful melodies. It could almost be like a kind of like a No Man album in a way.
I really enjoyed that one. I mean, that's an example of an album that was really enjoyable to make, and I'm really pleased we did it. I still really like it. It's got a very singular sound. And that happened when both Peter and I were living in Norfolk. We were in Norwich, and I think it was before our relationships became serious. So we were basically going around to one another's houses, watching films until 4 a.m, writing when we'd finished the films.
Yeah.
And it came out of kind of a really free-form, happy period because I know the music might be miserable.
But I was going to say, the music doesn't sound happy. It sounds plaintive. It sounds...
Yes, it's plaintive. But it was a great productive period because Burning Shed was taking off. We were living very close by. And we'd just kind of get together at all hours making this music. And it was kind of, as you say, although it's plaintive, it was born out of enthusiasm. And I think it's a lot better. You're right. It's an album. It's an awful lot better than My Hotel Year.
I think it's cool. Oh, it's beautiful. And that kind of came out, around 2002-ish?
Yeah, it's one of the first Burning Shed label official CDs.
And then we missed this one. I'm sorry I missed this because this album is stunning, man. It is just, well, look, you and I are both big fans of Mr. Barbieri. The guy has a special magic that really nobody else has, in my opinion. He will often tell you, I'm not a what's the word? A virtuoso on the keyboard. I'm not a Rick Wakeman or something like that. But what he is this sonic creator of soundscapes that nobody else has that sound. And you and him together on this thing are amazing. I guess Steve Jansen's on it, I believe.
Yeah. Steve Jansen, Nick Carn.
And Carn. So it's kind
Gavin
of
Harrison.
Yeah, it's kind of that's right. Gavin's on this for the first time. It's kind of a JBK album with you on vocals is basically what it is.
It is. And I think it kind of sounds like that as well in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because if I think of 94, I've got much more of a fond memory of Flower Mouth, really. I think Flower Mouth,
you're doing these
simultaneously,
right. Mm-hmm.
And I really like Flower Mouth as an album. Flame, I'm less keen on, not because of Richard, but because of my contribution. Part of me wonders in retrospect whether I just put the best of me in Flower Mouth.
Okay.
And this, I think, is a great Richard Barbieri album. It's not a particularly good Tim Bowness album. I'm not necessarily as proud of my lyrical or vocal performance on this one, and I think it was maybe too much to be making 2 albums at the same time. Just my personal
I disagree respectfully. Sorry, I think this is a killer album. I love this album. And I love all the JBK material too, because it's very unique, and it's obviously carrying on the Japan sort of thing.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah,
but it's beautiful stuff. And so we hit that one. I had a question from somebody. I don't know if he left. Alakazam here asked, Tim, what is your thoughts on Silver Apples and their experimentation? I'm sure you are a fan.
Well, I know the work. Yeah, not intimately, to be honest. But we were signed to the same label as Silver Apples at one point, so we used to get some of their albums for free. And
I know Stephen did something with them.
Yeah, did a remix.
With Bass Communion, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think there was a certain period when we were, more familiar with their music and liked their openness and their experimentation. I wouldn't say they were a major influence for us, but certainly we were aware of them and respected what they did.
Right. So we're up to, first we talked about, okay. So No Man, the one thing that came out of Schoolyard Ghosts is not just another stunning album for the most part, but also you do your first live shows in almost 15 years, I think.
15 years, yeah.
Yeah, and that was pretty remarkable, because I mean that was something that I think most of us as No Man fans, and also most of us that were PT fans, just never thought would really happen. And I've got to believe to some extent you probably thought it would never happen, right?
I don't know. I think I always did. Weirdly enough, I've kind of always gone, yeah.
Really?
No, I'm always kind of quite, despite the pessimism in my lyrical work, I'm always quite optimistic. And so I'm always quite, so I always kind of felt it would happen, because I think No Man is something that spiritually means a great deal to Steve and I. And, and they were great gigs. It was really enjoyable to do that. The gig that was recorded, unfortunately, I had a terrible cold and I couldn't sing properly.
That was for mixtape?
Yeah, for mixtape. So I'm really unhappy with that, because I was ill. And I think the performance is poor from my side. And I also think that the audience communication isn't as great as it became. If you saw No Man 2008 and then saw No Man in 2011 and 2012, it was a different band. In terms of audience communication, in terms of passion, in terms of the variety of the music, I think we really came alive in 2011, 2012. So it was
I have
really
to go
moving.
back and watch them, but because it's been a while since I've seen that stuff. But I can imagine if you weren't feeling well that day, you're not going to be at your best. But I think did the gigs come about as a result of you pushing for that, or did Stephen approach you and say, why don't we do a few shows for this?
I honestly can't remember, but we just decided we were going to do it, and we were both on board with it. And it mostly used the musicians that I was working with at that time: Michael Bear Park, Stephen Bennett,
Pete,
Andy
Chilvers.
Booker. Yeah, no, Peter Chilvers wasn't in the band, actually.
Oh, he wasn't. Okay, yeah, Steve Bingham on. You brought in Steve Bingham.
Steve Bingham, he's amazing. Yeah, he's a great player. And Ben Coleman also appeared.
That's right.
On the final track and encore, I think.
Yeah, so
it was a very emotional gig. It was an emotional gig, but technically I was dreadful because I had an awful cold and I could barely speak. So
that's a bummer.
No, it was. That made it even worse, because of course I'd been building up to this for years and I felt awful and I couldn't sing properly. And then by the time we'd got to Holland for the next gigs, I was fine. So it was really good. But anyway, it was a very positive experience for everybody, and that led to us gigging again in 2011. And I think that the Love and Endings album comes from that time, and I really like that. I think that captures what we sounded like.
Also, we should mention that has the documentary with it.
That has the documentary with it. Well, no, sorry, the mixtape has the documentary.
Oh, the mixtape was the documentary. Yeah. That's right. What's the name of the guy that did most of the work on that?
He's a guy called Richard Smith, and he was a TV presenter for BBC.
We used to be in contact a lot, and I couldn't remember his name. And unfortunately, Tim, I'm going to tell you, That's one I missed out on because there was a lot going on in my life at that point, and I
Right.
kind of dropped out on. I told you I'd kind of missed a period of things, and that was around when it started, 09, 11. I got involved with somebody and was very deeply involved. There was a lot going on there, and I wasn't as tuned into what was happening with the No Man and even the Porcupine Tree camp. I kind of around 9, 10. It was when I sort of stepped back from a lot of that stuff, but how was it to shoot that documentary for you? Was it really was it nostalgic? Was it cathartic? Was it what was that experience like?
It was fine. I mean, Richard Smith, who made it, is a lovely guy, and he made it feel quite effortless. I mean, it's a weird time. It's a weird time looking back on it for me, because it just seems so different. It's almost like ancient history.
Right.
It was great for somebody as talented and intelligent as Richard to acknowledge that our music was important to him. And the gigs, Richard came along on the tours with us actually, and it was fun. We all got on really, really well. I've only ever watched it once.
No kidding.
And that was when I saw it in its entirety. We did a couple of premieres in London, and it was nice because it was like a little theatre and it was sold out and people were watching this. And I think looking back on it, I kind of seem a lot more intense and less happy. It is what I remember of it, but I can't remember. And what had happened is that when it eventually got mixed, I think 2009, when it was eventually released, I was in a totally different relationship and a totally different space. Right. And also by 2010, I'd had my first and only child as well. So my life was in a very different place, really.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, to me, it's almost like ancient history, and I've only really seen it the once. And I remember thinking, "Oh God, I'm a little too self-conscious. I'm a little too intense." And I think that again, it was a bit like I told you that when I heard my very first album, the Always the Stranger album, or the After the Stranger album, sorry, when I heard it, I realized how shit I was. I think that when I saw the interviews in the film, I thought, oh my God, it's just too intense. It's too this. And it was kind of liberating in a way. And the gigs we did after that, Stephen and I mean, it's something that people don't quite realize. The music is as intense and as melancholy, but actually we were a damn good comedy act. By the time we were playing, 2011, 2012, it was a very different band.
I mean, I wasn't going to go here, but I'll go here a little bit. I know Steve pretty well. At least I did. And a lot of people think that he's this really droll. I mean, back because of his lyrics, because of the PT stuff, the dark stuff that he did, some of the darker stuff, melancholy, very melancholic. Steve's really not like that in person. He's pretty funny. I mean, we had an experience I think it was 05 or 06 out in LA, because I traveled out to the West Coast to do the West Coast run with him. And he and I went to Amoeba, and I think we spent like 3 hours in Amoeba in LA just shopping and, oh, look what I got, look what I found, that kind of stuff like that. And it was, he's not this taciturn. He's a pretty funny guy. I mean, he's a pretty upbeat guy generally.
Well, I think both. It's an odd thing because No Man's Sessions, apart from, as I said, Schoolyard Ghosts, which was quite miserable, apart from the very end, when we ended on Wherever There Is Light, which came together spontaneously. Apart from that was a bit of a miserable session, really. Other than that, everything we've ever done as No Man has been great fun. Stephen and I get on really well. It's very humorous a lot of the time. Obviously, I think the album years kind of shows the relationship that we've got, that we can always talk. Right. And I think that both of us have quite deep emotions. Both of us are drawn to melancholy things, but essentially, we can be quite positive, talkative people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there's no doubt. When you guys get going on your album year stuff, it's I know music pretty well. I think I know music pretty well, but boy, the two of you together, it's kind of like incendiary as far as your knowledge and your opinions. And the things that you throw back and forth. I mean, Steven's got a pretty acerbic wit, as do you. So, couple more albums, and I'll try to get you out of here real quick. We'll do. How about this one here? You do a collaboration with. Where's that? I apologize for these not being in order. I'm trying to. Here we go. Memory of Machines with Giancarlo Era. And he actually co-wrote a track or two on Schoolyard Ghosts, right? Track, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Giancarlo I got involved with 2005. He sent me some no sound material, which I liked. He asked me to collaborate with him, and we wrote a song called Someone Starts to Fade Away. And it was an enjoyable experience. Periodically, he then just came around to my house and we wrote material together, which eventually ended up on Memories of Machines. And, you know, Giancarlo's a lovely guy. And the album came together relatively effortlessly. And we also wrote some of it in New York, as I think I was saying, that we wrote about 3 pieces when I was living in Manhattan. We wrote 3 of the album's pieces there in about 2006. And we carried on writing at my home in England after that. And we also used my song Schoolyard Ghosts, which is a piece I'd written for the album Schoolyard Ghosts, but it morphed into mixtaped. So the No Man version was so different. Basically, that was my song that I brought into the sessions. And Stephen slowed it down and added a coda, so it became a No Man track, and I rewrote the lyrics. But Schoolyard Ghosts is essentially the genesis of the track Mixtaped from Schoolyard Ghosts.
Oh, really? Okay, wow.
Yeah. You will hear the same chords, but a very different approach to it. And so the Schoolyard Ghosts thing was me just going in the studio with a group of musicians and getting them to do my bidding one day, and then Giancarlo adding to it. And it was a lovely album to make and relaxed over a few years, really.
So to get to a couple, you actually, that was 2014, I think, that came out, right? That was winter
2011.
Oh, it was 2011. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I missed. Oh, I had 2014. Oops, my bad. My first big screw up there. I apologize for that.
Fine.
So you have 2014, 2015. You released 2 albums: Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, Stupid Things That Mean the World, and they're kind of companion pieces. Talk a little bit about those. I'll put these up. This is album number 2 and number 3 from your solo catalog.
Well, this is the thing. This is the interesting story of the Abandoned Dancehall Dreams. Basically, that was an album that I'd written half the material and I'd co-written half the material. And unlike My Hotel Year, which was kind of a rag bag of tracks I was working on with other people, this was something I had a really strong idea about from the off. So I'd written the material, I'd co-written the material, and I presented it to Stephen. And in fact, this was going to be the follow-up to Schoolyard Ghosts, because Schoolyard Ghosts started like this, where I came in with Schoolyard Ghosts, with the exception of Wherever There Is Light. All of the material was either written by me or co-written with people I was working with that I'd brought in, and then Stephen added to.
Right.
And we were going to work on an album called Abandoned Dancehall Dreams that was exactly the same. So this was going to be the follow-up to Schoolyard Ghosts.
Ah, okay.
And then Stephen said, look, I think this is a really strong collection. And let's face it, it's your collection. We can do it. But he at the time was working on The Raven. And so he said, what I'll do is this. I'll mix this for you. And in effect, it is your solo album because you just brought this to me as a fait accompli, in effect.
Right.
And that's what happened. So in effect, Abandoned Dancehall Dreams was a pretty much complete album that I brought to Stephen with a view of it being the follow-up to Schoolyard Ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen mixed it for me. And it turned out really well. You know, I think the album turned out well. The response to it turned out well. I got signed to Inside Out, which then became Inside Out Sony.
Right.
And the album sold a lot better than I was expecting. And that then led to the solo work. You know, this was all written solo. So Stephen wasn't a part of the
I got you.
process. He mixed it in the end. But it was going to be it was my idea of what was going to be the follow-up to Schoolyard Ghosts. And then with the success of that, I wrote and co-wrote, what became Stupid Things That Mean the World. So basically that's when the solo career picked up, that,
Took off.
this,
Yeah,
there was
right.
a momentum. And it's been kind of non-stop since then in terms of the solo work. Obviously I've had people I've worked with who've been great facilitators and collaborators, people like Stephen Bennett, people like obviously Brian Hulse from Plenty coming back into the picture.
Michael
But generally
Bearpark.
speaking, and Bear Park coming back again, Peter Chilvers appearing.
Chilvers, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and others. But generally speaking, these albums, I've had a very strong idea in terms of title, material, and they've come together, in the way usually it's sort of 33% to 50% I've written all of, and then 50% I've co-written either with Brian or with Stephen Bennett or other people. But they've always come, even those contributions, there's been a very strong lyrical direction and a very strong musical direction. Whereas My Hotel Year was 4 or 5 different projects,
right,
wedged together uncomfortably. All of the solo albums from Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, including that, have been focused, collaborative, focused albums where I've had the vision of the album, and then I've had luckily talented people like Stephen Bennett or Brian Hulse to work with me on these albums.
A quick question that I don't know whether I'm dreaming this or I'm just thinking this happened, but was there not a time, and I'm coming back, I'm just trying to find the cover to where's that? Did I forget to bring this one over? Oh, there it is. So this would be the companion piece that came out the year after, I believe, 15. Yeah. But I have a question real quick on the No Man thing. When Schoolyard Ghosts came out and you did some touring and whatnot, and then Stephen really immersed himself in his solo. He had the Insurgentes come out, and then the follow-up with, don't tell me. Like Dust I Have Cleared from My Eye. No, that's not it. Grace for Drowning. Mm-hmm. Am I dreaming that Steve made the statement that he was kind of turning No Man over to you to do what you wanted to do with it? Or am I...
I'm not sure. I mean, Schoolyard Ghosts, basically, with the exception of Wherever There Is Light that we spontaneously wrote at the end of the sessions and was a wonderful way to end it all of that material originated either from me or from collaborations that I'd been having, either with Giancarlo Erra or Alistair Murphy, the curator, people like that. So, Schoolyard Ghosts would not have happened without really my energy and my writing. And maybe, I think at that stage, he was thinking, this is what, basically Abandoned Dancehall Dreams was going to be the follow-up No Man album to Schoolyard Ghosts, in which the idea that we had, because in Schoolyard Ghosts, apart from Wherever There Is Light, it was a truly collaborative thing with myself and Stephen. And to be fair, True North, because although I've written the opening part completely and we'd suggested what we were going to do together afterwards, he really got involved and really started writing on the track True North. But generally speaking, that album was pieces I'd brought in. And this is how, Abandoned Dancehall Dreams was going to be the follow-up album to Schoolyard Ghosts. But in the end, Stephen said, well, actually, I think it's strong enough as it is, and I've just not got the time. So I think at that time, that was what his mindset was going to be, that he was I was going to be the main writer.
Right.
He was going to be the main producer with me. That was the whole point. But when it came down to it, he said, well, actually, why not just release this as your solo album, because it is your solo album at this stage.
Gotcha.
And he was immersed, as I said, in The Raven at that stage. Mm-hmm. And so we abandoned that idea really of him just being the producer on it. And when we did Love You to Bits, that really was, a collaborative project. It was No Man almost back to the
very early days.
Yeah. It was just the two of us in the studio making this noise together, and it was joyous. It was a great album to make.
Yeah, I'm almost there. I wanted to just hit one or two more of your solo albums here. So this one here comes out in 15, and the interesting thing here is that Steven does not mix it. It's mixed by Pineapple Thief's Bruce Sword. Was that a conscious decision to go away from Steve, or was Steve just didn't have the time?
That was Stephen didn't have the time.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a simple.
I had the feeling. I had the feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, and Bruce was great. You know, it was really enjoyable to work with Bruce.
How do you feel about this album now in context of your solo work?
Well, Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, I really liked, and I thought it was a solid piece of work. And I think that when I presented it to Stephen, in effect, and this is why I think he said, look, release this as a solo album, because I basically put it all together. And half the material I'd written entirely, half I'd written as co-writes with people like Stephen Bennett. And he said, this is your work. This is your solo album. And so he mixed it. So I think that gave me a lot of confidence. And I remember kind of writing like the title track of Stupid Things That Mean the World, almost in the energy of the feedback I was getting from Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, that the label really liked it. People who were hearing the demos of it were incredibly positive and felt it was kind of a fresh direction for me. And so I kind of wrote Stupid Things That Mean the World off the energy of that. And again, I probably wrote over half of it solo. And then one of them was me completing an Oman track that we'd never finished, Sing to Me. And then there'd be a couple of collaborations. So that was kind of created almost in the slipstream of Abandoned Dancehall Dreams. It was, it was very enjoyable to make, and quite a lot of it was recorded in Phil Manzanera's studio in London.
Oh yeah, Rocks and Music.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. 2017, you've got Lost in the Ghostlight, which is actually, I really like this album. This is a really cool one, especially this track, Moonshot Manchild. Very, very cool track for you. Pretty experimental, long piece. Talk about that real quickly.
Well, that album partly came out of Henry Fool. So Henry Fool was a project that I kind of done as a one-off.
Oh, that's right. I missed that.
Stephen Bennett, Michael Bearpart, Peter Chilvers, Andy Booker, The Crowd. And we kind of improvised a sort of krautrock, prog rock album. And it was mainly me and Stephen Bennett who were coming up with this. And I continued to write with Stephen Bennett. And we'd written a few tracks that I felt were very strong, but that weren't right for any of the solo albums. And suddenly I hit upon this concept of the fake band. This would work for the material. So that material, although it was driven very much by my production and by my central idea of the fake band, because it was quite complex, I'd co-written a lot of it with Stephen Bennett. So it was really kind of an idea that was driven by me, but I was aided a lot by Stephen Bennett, as he's a fantastic musician. Mm-hmm. And that was really enjoyable to do, actually. It was this concept of the fake band. And originally how I wanted it to be was I wanted somebody else to sing it. I wanted this to be a fake band, a history of a fake musician. Yeah. There is an essay that goes with it, so it was great fun to actually make a kind of a concept album that was effectively about music and the way in which music and music idealism had changed from 1967 to the present day. And I'd written a character, so it was fantastic, almost like writing a play in a sense, and the music was reflecting the music of the band, not necessarily me. So this is why it was more openly progressive in parts, because it was a band from the 60s, a band from the 70s, a band trying to morph into the 80s.
Right.
But real good fun making it. And of course, with the production of these albums, whereas I'd be co-writing that one, Stephen Bennett was certainly a big part of, I'd be getting in the musicians in terms of, this is the voice I want, this is the player I want, and so on. So, very enjoyable album to make, really.
We're almost there, Tim. We're almost there. I know. I told you what you were in for. You can't say I didn't warn you.
It is true, yeah. Of course, the thin air. I will be spouting nonsense very soon. But go on.
No. You're doing well. You're doing well, and I can't thank you enough for hanging in there with me. I put a lot of time into this, obviously, you can tell. But let me just find one more here. We're almost there. Come on now. Where's it at? Where's it at? Where's it at? Where's it at? Oh, talk real quick. You had some prog legends on the Ghostlight while I find the image of your next album. Ian Anderson and Kit Watkins are on that album.
Yeah, because it was, in a sense, it was a fake history of a band. And what I wanted to do with Lost in the Ghostlight was talk about idealism in music and also the history of musical evolution. So I kind of took a character that I'd invented, there was a short story around it and so on. And it's this character's adventures through music. So this character gets into music in the 60s, which is a profoundly idealistic time when music is the cultural force, and ends up going through the 80s where it's a commercial force. So it's kind of a comment on the history of music as much as anything else, post Sgt. Pepper's musical idealism and where it led.
And you're a student of that because, like I said, I think I know music pretty well from that era, and we're both relatively close in age. Stephen as well. Steve, I think, is a year and a half or two behind me, and I'm 2 behind you. So we're all in that era of like the golden age of music for me is the 70s. And I mean, a lot of it's pretentious to say, but it really is. I think it's really true. Here we've got your 2019 Flowers at the Scenes, another successful solo outing. You've got Stephen coming back in. You've also got Peter Hamill, which I think he's collaborated before he got Andy Partridge from XTC. And interestingly, you have Jim Matheos from Fates Warning, which you sang on a song, a Fates Warning. I'm sorry, not a Fates Warning, an OSI song. Yeah. And that would be, no. Almost exited myself out of the screen. That would have not been good. This album right here is called Blood by OSI, which is the project between Jim Matheos and Kevin Moore, who was a member of Dream Theater way back when, and then has his own project, Chroma Key. Talk about Jim Matheos. How did he come into the picture? Was this a payback for guesting on the OSI album? You asked him to come on?
Yeah. I mean, they asked me to guest on that album, and I really enjoyed doing it because it was very different for me. Musically, I thought it got something different out of me, and I think they're fantastic musicians. And Jim's a lovely guy. I've only ever dealt with him, and it's funny, we've written quite a lot of stuff together actually, and worked on various recordings, but I've only ever dealt with him in email and sharing files.
Right.
And the same with Kevin. But it was a really nice track to do, and he's worked on tracks of mine since then, and I've also worked on a few things with him that haven't been released that may be released at some point. So it's good, and I'm still in contact with Jim in particular.
An amazing writer, amazing
writer. And my experience of him is really good. Seems like a very nice guy. I've never met him, but
interesting. So as you brought up, oh my goodness, what's this? 2019. There's a new No Man album, which it passed me by. I didn't find out about it for about 6 months. I'm like, wait, what? Wait, I thought that was a done deal. Like, I really did. I thought No Man was kind of dead at that point. And you come back with Love You to Bits. Comes out November of 2019. It's the first No Man album. I currently don't own that one. It's the only one I don't own. What was the genesis of this? And, it appears a lot of it's goes back to 1994 in a lot of ways. There's a lot of material that was resurrected, right?
Well, it came, firstly, we were going to make a No Man album in 2013 because we did a tour in 2011 and 2012, and that's there's a live album we released from that. I think it might be Love and Endings, is it? And that was great, a really enjoyable tour, very energetic, and I think the band came into their own. We'd created another unique sound for No Man. I think that everyone enjoyed it, including Stephen. So the idea was that we were going to make another No Man solo album in the wake of that with that live band. And The Warm Up Man Forever, the track that starts off my solo career in effect with Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, was something that I'd written that No Man played live on that tour. So there were a couple of songs that ended up on Abandoned Dancehall Dreams that were on the No Man tour of 2011-2012.
Do you think that Love You to Bits, to some extent, too, kind of evolved out of Steven's, let's say, how do I put this? His move towards more electronic music again with his last solo album, was that part of it, or is a lot of this really old that was resurrected and shaped into this?
It's a combination. So basically, we were going to make, as I said, a No Man band album using the live band and the material
Okay.
that I'd written for Band and Dancehall Dreams in 2013, 2014. And I'd recorded the band. So basically, I'd written a lot of the material. I'd taken the band in the studio. And the idea was then that Stephen would work his Wilsonian magic on it. But he thought it should be a solo album. And it came directly out of the tour. And the tour was really enjoyable. And I think we'd created quite a new sound for No Man. But anyway, Love You to Bits was a piece that was either 4 minutes or 8 minutes long. It varied. That we'd written originally in 94. Then we'd expanded in 98 with Theo Travis. And we'd never really taken it anywhere. But both of us had this idea that we wanted to write a disco symphony. And we'd always had this in the back of our minds. And so suddenly the time freed up. Stephen was ready for a No Man album. This was, interesting enough, very like Love Blows and Love Cries, the first album we made. This was what you call, a fully collaborative thing of the two of us in the studio, just throwing concepts at one another. And it was amazing fun to make, really. The opposite of Schoolyard Ghosts, which hadn't been fun to make, though I loved the album. Together with Stranger was great fun to make as well. But this was just like the beginning of the band when we were throwing anything. And so we'd suddenly decided we're going to make this 8-minute piece into the album we always visualized. And we'd always had this idea of a 2-part concept album that would be linked thematically, lyrically, and musically. And we both had the time to dedicate to it in 2019. And for me, it was when I'd finished Flowers at the Scene. I think I went straight into this. And it was lovely to make. It was a really enjoyable album to make. And I'm really pleased because I think we kind of fulfilled our idea for it, really. It was kind of like an old-fashioned disco symphony, but with a lot of ideas in the mix. There's a lot of experimental ambient, a lot of experimental rock, and there's some beautiful passages. And for me, it's also one of our first, if not only, fully conceptual albums lyrically as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. It took me a little by surprise because I was expecting something more in the vein of Schoolyard or Returning Jesus. I mean, it really was a left turn back to, or no, it was kind of a 180. It was going all the way back to the kind of the origins of the band, the early origins of it. So I have to pick that one up, and I apologize for not owning that. Okay, we're at 2020. We're almost there, Tim.
I was going to say, one thing about that album is that originally we were going to work on it. It was going to be the follow-up to Flowermouth. That in effect, we'd written that and we'd written Lighthouse. And one of our original concepts was to have an album with 2 songs. One would be a 20-minute version of Love You to Bits.
Right.
The other was going to be a 20-minute version of Lighthouse.
Oh my God.
And that was going to be
Lighthouse.
And then we just got taken over by Wild Opera. We went in a completely different direction. So it was kind of, Returning Jesus was picking up where Lighthouse left off, and Love You to Bits was picking up on an idea that we had in 1994. But a lot of the music was written in 2019. The performances, the music. We suddenly had the time to dedicate to this idea that we'd had.
Who was the impetus for that? Did Steve call you up and say, "Hey Tim, I got this. Let's finish this thing," or did you approach him and say, "Hey, how'd that come about?" Because
difficult to know. Because I think that with a lot of the albums, it was just both of us had the impetus. So I'd say that everything up to Schoolyard Ghosts, both of us were pushing.
No, I meant with this Love You to Bits. Was that both of you kind of going, you should finish this?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Okay. And I think with Schoolyard Ghosts, I think that was kind of me a bit forcing the issue. Yep. And Abandoned Dancehall Dreams, had it been released as a No Man album, it would have been me forcing the issue. Yep, but this was completely mutual,
Yeah.
really collaborative, mutual enthusiasm, and finally kind of realizing an idea that we'd had for a very long time.
So we got Late Night Laments in 2020, fast on the heels of the last album. And again, this is on, and then you've got Butterfly Mind, which actually I really, really, really like. That is a really good album. We'll talk briefly about that. Anything to say about Late Night Laments and Butterfly Mind?
I love Late Night Laments, and that was an album that started with a song that I'd written very late night. I was writing a lot of this stuff because my child was younger at the time, and you have these long bedtimes, and you're going to be woken up in the middle of the night and so on.
Oh, yeah.
So I was writing a lot of this stuff. It was nocturnal writing, and there was a real mood and throughout. And I wrote a couple of pieces that I then played to Brian Hulse, and Brian picked up on the mood immediately. So he knew what I was getting at with the pieces I'd written. So he was throwing things at me that fitted in with the concepts I had in mind. And that was a lovely album to make, really. Although it was a sad album, it was a very nice album to make. And it was an about turn from Love You to Bits, which had been a very physical, very aggressive album. This was very ambient and laid back. And of course, the album that then follows that, Butterfly Mind, I felt exhausted. At the end of Late Night Laments, I kind of felt I'd done everything. I'd written quite a few albums in quick succession.
Yes, you have, yeah.
And the Plenty album, one of the Plenty albums that we did came out of the thing of trying to reboot creativity. There was a year where I wasn't necessarily writing, but I was rewriting Plenty stuff with Brian.
Right.
And then suddenly with Butterfly Mind, I came up with a few pieces, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with this album. This was flying all over. It was whereas I think Late Night Laments was much more static and much more focused musically. Butterfly Mind, as the title suggests, was all over the place, and I think has some of the most aggressive and experimental material I've ever written outside of Wild Opera No Man. And a lot of that came about from material I started off, and then I started writing with Brian, who again, he's got a great instinct for things and picked up on what I wanted to do. So I'd say that about, roughly half of that album I'd kind of written and then taken it to Brian, and then roughly Brian had written some instrumental material that he felt was echoing what I was coming up with, and then I was writing the lyrics and melodies, and we were both collaborating then on the final production of it. So that was, it was a really kind of exciting album to make, and I think it kind of comes across really.
Yeah, there's some great tracks on here. Two that I wanted to point out real quick. The one talking about experimental, We Feel, is very, very. It's got that thing going on, man. There's some really crunchy guitars in there, which is not usually something that you are known for. And then, to me, just the standout track, which is Dark Nevada Dream. What an amazing song. And that little guitar line in there, that simple little it just sucks you in, and you've got just that Dark Nevada Dream, just so beautiful. And I'm sorry for butchering your voice, but yeah, it's an amazingly good album, and it made me go, oh god, I gotta go buy all this stuff now. So
it's really enjoyable to do, and I think that Brian as a collaborator is great because he picks up on what I want to do. So when I'm doing Late Night Laments, I've written a couple of pieces, I've sent them to him, and he immediately understands what I'm wanting to then progress and do. And it was pretty much the same with Butterfly Mind, which is much more eclectic, because I'd kind of come up with almost immediately pieces like Always the Stranger, which was the title of the first solo band I'd ever been in. And I was coming up with probably the extremes of material that were quite experimental and quite poppy and propulsive. So kind of anything went with that, really. And this is sort of led, as I said, at the moment, I'm about 36 minutes through an album where I've written, produced, and played everything at the moment. So it's very different again. But it's kind of coming out of Butterfly Mind, because I think Butterfly Mind was such an eclectic and exciting experience to make.
It's very, there's a lot of range. There's a range of tracks on here that's a little more expansive than some of your other solo albums. This new one that you're working on, do you anticipate any kind of a release? Are we looking at maybe late this year or next year?
Probably not. I'm thinking early next year, and I've got about 34 minutes of it at the moment, and it's been really exciting to do. It's difficult to know how good it is because it's all me at the moment playing and singing, and I think it's got, in some ways, it's coming to, in the way that Together We're Stranger came out of Returning Jesus, because Together We're Stranger to me came out of the idealism, especially the title track of Returning Jesus, and it was also with the confidence we thought we can do this. And I think this album kind of is partly because Brian felt that with the stuff I'd written last time, he said, look, I'm making it more musical, but it'd be really interesting to see what you just do with this yourself. Maybe even if it's just one album experiment where you're playing everything. And it's been really energizing, to an extent. He's been right. So far, it's difficult to gauge how good it is, but I tend to be a creature of instinct. So the material, a bit like Butterfly Mind, is flitting from extremes of noise to extremes of beauty to my most uncommercial material to my most commercial material.
Yeah.
Because it's how am I feeling today? How am I going to work today? So, surprisingly, it has, one of the most upbeat short pop songs I've ever written. And then it has possibly the ugliest noise fest you're ever likely to come across. So it's kind of very mood driven, but it's been exciting to do, really. So that's what I'm doing. And I kind of anticipate next year, because although I think 90% of it is going to end up being me playing everything,
right.
I'm probably going to get a rhythm section on a couple of tracks and a solo. So, for example, one of the pieces I've been using some Ben from the last album, where I thought, okay, I need this voice in it. So I've been sampling Ben out and using him in a completely different way on pieces. So, that's been fun. And also I've co-written something with Ben recently, and we've been doing some playing.
Wait, are we talking about Ben Mink or who?
No, with Ben. Sorry, Ben Coleman.
Oh, okay, Coleman. Okay,
the No Man violinist.
Right. He was on this album? Did I miss that?
Yeah, Ben played. So for me, it was the first time I'd worked with Ben since Flowermouth. He plays violin.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Which tracks are you on? Did I miss that, or?
He's on Dark Nevada Dream for a start.
Yeah, he is. Okay. Sorry, my brain's a little bit frazzled at this point. I want to get you out of here in 5 minutes. So, anything to say about the album years? I mean, it's kind of there's no real schedule to it. It kind of happens when it happens.
Yeah, I mean, it happens when we're both free, and it's really enjoyable. It started off as a lockdown project. We talked about it over the phone, and it came together really quickly. And basically, the only people I know who don't listen to it are people who are in the band No Man, the live No Man band, because they say, "Oh, we've heard this. This is just you talking on the tour bus." Yeah,
that's all you guys talk about on the bus. Yeah. Do you do it live, or do you do it over? Live stream?
We do it live in this way, but then we both edit it. Yeah. And we'll talk for about 2, 3, 4 hours and then edit it down to about an hour, because we're both ruthless control freaks in certain respects.
Right.
So, if I got hold of this tape, you'd probably have one sentence at the end of it all.
Oh, this one here?
Yeah, even this.
I hate to break it to you, Tim, but I own this. Sorry. I'm a control freak too. All right. So last two things. The No Man box set, you can't really give us any more details on because you don't know.
It's finished, yeah. I mean, basically, It's got all of the One Little Indian material plus lots of extras. Really nice booklet written by Matt, who does a wonderful No Man fan site. Check out all the blue changes.
Is this going to be Snapper, K-Scope?
No, it's going to be One Little Indian. It's going to be who are now One Little Independent. They've changed their name, but
any projected idea when that might come out?
Well, it was going to be released next month, but due to the Porcupine Tree reissue and due to Stephen's solo album, it looks like next January is most likely.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Steve's working, or he's kind of done with a new solo album, I believe, right? Yeah, and that's going to be coming out later in the year. And that's
going to be announced soon.
June, I think, right?
So I think probably January next year.
how extensive is it going to be? Is it going to be several discs or just one or two?
Yeah,
or?
it's about, I think it's 4 or 5.
Oh my
So it's
goodness.
got all of the studio albums, it's got all of the B-sides, it's got a few tracks that didn't make it to the albums.
Mm.
And it's also got all of the radio sessions, including a couple that haven't been released.
Nice. Well, I'll have to start saving for that. Let's see. Let me just do real quick. Oh, we talked about this question, and I think you've kind of answered, and I don't think there's really an answer to it at this point now. Was there ever a time that you were kind of, what's the word I want to use here? For lack of a better term, where you were upset that there was not as much attention paid to No Man by Steven when some of the stuff was happening with him as far as PT or his solo thing, or did you just kind of figure, well, he's got that going, I'm going to have to figure out my own path and do my own thing then?
No, I think probably the only time would have been the mid-1990s, and it was a kind of a difficult period because I was in a relationship that was falling apart, living in London. And No Man, it was obvious that One Little Indian suddenly weren't going to give us all the money in the studio time that we'd had previously.
Right.
And Porcupine Tree were also coming up on the side, really. And I knew all of them. So I was really, firstly, I was really happy for their success because they deserved it. And they were friends of mine.
Right.
So that was absolutely fine. But on a personal level, with a relationship that was collapsing, a record label deal that wasn't turning out to be the dream that we'd hoped it was, the mid to late 90s was a bit of a miserable time. But very quickly, I was kind of over that because Stephen and I continued to write, and I think we were writing some of the best stuff we'd ever written. Returning Jesus came out of that period. I might have been miserable, but I think the work we were producing together was special. Stephen was still loyal, and actually I was really pleased that friends of mine were having big success, and eventually I think there kind of came a sort of camaraderie that Porcupine Tree fans felt compelled to find out about No Man, and vice versa, because No Man were playing to decent crowds. When we stopped playing live, we were selling out London shows, and we were selling a reasonable quantity of albums. Flowermouth, as I said, sold about 30,000 at the time, which is pretty decent.
Wow.
Okay. And it was of course upsetting that it was no longer Stephen's main interest, but we carried on communicating as friends, we carried on working as musicians, and I think in a way it's been quite complementary, really. So for me, I think that both of us, me through Burning Shed and other means, Stephen through his solo work and through Porcupine Tree, we've both had successes, and I think they kind of complemented the stuff we've done. And I think first and foremost, we remain curious friends. If I'm meeting up with Stephen or talking with him, I mean, this is one of the things. The people who toured with No Man said who don't listen to the album years, they said, we don't need to listen to it. We heard you on the tour bus.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that Stephen and I, when we first met in 1987, I got off the train from Warrington to Hemel Hempstead, and we talked. We talked for 2 or 3 hours non-stop before we made music, and that was great. And when we get together again, when we were doing, Love You to Bits, we talk for 2 or 3 hours full stop, then we concentrate on music for 6 hours. And it's still the same thing that we kind of meet up.
That nexus of friendship that's the important part, and then the creative part comes as a result of that friendship.
To an extent, yeah. We've always just kind of connected and got on, really. It's like, if we were to be meeting now, suddenly it would just bounce off into various conversational detours.
Right. I got a couple of albums for you to look at quick, and then I'm going to get you out of here because you probably got to pee, I'm guessing. So I'm assuming, because I do too, but I'm going to throw these at you. And what I used to do was trash or treasure, meaning trash doesn't mean you hate the album. It may mean you just don't even know it. Treasure means you've got some thoughts on it real quick. So I'll blast you with these. This is the box set, by the way. Simple Minds' New Gold Dream.
Yeah, I'm going to go for Treasure on that one. I always liked it. Good album, nice, consistent sound.
Are you a fan of Simple Minds overall?
I'm a fan of Simple Minds up to and including Sparkle in the Rain.
Sparkle in the Rain's amazing.
I think Sparkle in the Rain is brilliant, and I really like New Girl Dream. And I think they've done some decent stuff after that, but when I was a fan, would have been really Sparkle in the Rain, New Girl Dream, that sort of stuff was I really liked.
Gotcha.
And also particularly the Sister Feelings Call period. I think that was amazing.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, Fascination. Yeah.
Sons
How
and
about
Fascination.
this one?
Can't see it properly.
Boards of Canada, GeoGaddy.
To be honest, I have to pass on that. That's much more of a Stephen thing. I've heard it, know it, but more of a Stephen thing than me.
Cool. How about Stephen's favorite album? Or one of his favorite albums?
Yeah, he loves that. I mean, I knew it. You know, God, I had that album when I was, about 14, because I had a friend, John Davis, who was a massive Tangerine Dream fan. So I knew all of the Tangerine Dream albums. My personal favorite, where I think they kind of hit two sweet spots for me, Tangerine Dream. I really like the mid-70s stuff, Phaedra.
I think
is amazing. Rubicon. That's brilliant. And then I think they hit their groove again in the early 80s, where they're making their entry into film music. I think they're making some really distinctive and good music.
Like Sorcerer, the soundtrack to Sorcerer.
That sort of stuff. Yeah, that sort of era. Tangram.
Keep, stuff like that. Yeah,
and Tangram, that kind of stuff.
What about Force Majeure? That's a killer one too.
Yeah. That was. I think they kind of. Yeah,
I think I know what you're gonna say on this one.
Yeah, we loved. I mean, that was during the early days of No Man. We loved 1960s singer-songwriters, classical music, minimalist classical composers, jazz, and we were really in love with the 4AD label. So things like Dead Can Dance, Cocteau Twins, and also the Cherry Red label, artists like Eyeless and Gaza. We love these free-form experimentalists of the 80s. And that's a great album, Within the Realm of a Dying Sun. Is it that one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My favorite. I have I lucked into these. I was at a Borders bookstore. They've gone way out of business. These are the MoFi gold discs.
Right.
Really, Tim, I got these for like $12 each. They're going for like $150
a
piece, which is crazy. I got all but one. I missed out on one. All right, I know you can't say anything bad about this guy because you know him really well, right?
Well, XTC, I like anything else about. Yeah, great. I mean, it's a great album. One of my favorite XTC albums. I really like Apple Venus Volume 1 as well. One of the more spiritual XTC albums. XTC were a band that both Stephen and I loved, and Stephen and I have always swapped things. These are things that people don't know, that he and I have always had swaps, and we have ratings of, dusty, juicy, very juicy, and so on.
Okay.
And we will lay things on the floor, vinyl, CD, books.
Right.
Okay, juicy. But this is a triple J. It then becomes a trip. If something is very special, it's a triple J, And the thing with XTC was we both loved XTC. And I had on videotape very early on 2 XTC documentaries, including the making of various albums. And that became, I mention it in relation to swaps, one of the big swaps where Stephen desperately wanted it off me because it was before the time of streaming. I had this XTC documentary that I'd videotaped.
The Grail.
Yeah, and I think I managed to get about 8 LPs out of him for it in the swap because he was desperate for it.
Oh my goodness, no kidding. So that was the trade, huh? This is, I mean, every one of their albums practically, except for I'm not into the post-punk 2 first albums. They're kind of angular and a little not my thing so much. But this album, it's hard. I mean, there's so many killer albums. Just what incredible songwriters.
Yeah.
Andy Partridge, he's a fucking genius. Oh, there's 3. All right. I know you gotta like this album.
I do. I love it. It's not my favorite Bowie, but I love it. I think it's a great album.
My favorite.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, I still can't fault it. I think it's intense. It's dramatic. Bowie's been a massive influence for me since I first started really liking music, and remains it. I think some of his greatest work he was still making to the end. I think his very, very last album, Black Star, is in my top 3 Bowie's.
Stunning album. To know
Outside is
to know that he's dying. Outside's an amazing album. God, I love that album.
Yeah.
I have a question for you after we end. I want you to stick around for 1 minute. We're almost done, I promise. But I have a question for you then. It was regarding David Bowie. All right. How about this album?
I really like it. Yeah. I mean, it's a lovely album. Unexpected, some beautiful harmonies, great writing. And yeah, what I quite like about it is people talk about psychedelia as being unhinged. That is genuinely unhinged while still being really pretty.
Right. I mean, you got the Red Telephone. You've got, crazy songs like, maybe the people would be the times, or between Clark and Hilldale with, snot, and the snot is running down his nose. It's like Arthur Lee was kind of a creative genius.
Yeah. And
they struck
sounds
gold.
Great.
They struck gold right there. Yeah. All right. We're down to a couple more here. How about this one?
Yeah, I mean, the Doors, I wouldn't say they're a favorite band for me, but I've always liked them. And I've got all of their albums. So, they're one of those bands I've been aware of from the beginnings of me getting interested in music and rock music in particular. And I do like them. And I particularly love their Epics. I mean, that's possibly my favorite album, actually, Waiting for the Sun. It's a really
one
good
here,
album.
Waiting. I was curious if it would be this or if it would be the Soft Parade or maybe LA Woman. I mean, LA Woman's hard to overlook because of Riders on the Storm, which is my favorite. I mean,
LA Woman has got two of my favorite tracks, but isn't my favorite album. Soft Parade, I love the title track. Not so keen on the rest of the album. I really like, I think, the second and third album. So Strange Days.
Oh, Strange Days is great. Yeah,
I think is amazing.
I have I have this here that I pulled that out of the Doors box set.
Okay.
Which gets a lot of airplay. Almost done, Tim. Promise.
Queen. Well, actually, that's probably my favorite Queen album. I like.
Yes, same here.
Queen. I think they remained interesting. Even the very last album has got the stunning title track, Innuendo. That is
Innuendo
really
Innuendo is my third favorite Queen album. It is brilliant.
Yeah, and it is. It was a great way to end, and I think that with Queen, they were one of those bands that the first bands I ever really fell in love with when I was a kid at primary school.
Did you see him live with Freddie? Did you ever?
No,
I never did either. Yeah.
But the first bands I fell in love with, the first music I ever really fell in love with was John Barry's screen music.
Right.
And then I think that pop music, it was Sparks, this talent big enough for the both of us, Queen, Seven Seas of Rye and Bohemian Rhapsody and 10cc. Those were the things that I first really loved as pop music. And then very quickly Pink Floyd followed as well.
3 more. This is a double whammy here.
Oh, nice. Adore both of them. Yeah. Coltrane, Miles Davis.
My favorite Coltrane. My favorite Coltrane and probably my favorite Miles. Although I have so many Miles, it's so hard to pick with Miles.
I've got about 150 Miles Davis albums. So
well, I'm not in your category. Although
I've got the complete Columbia box set.
The Metal Spine ones. Or an album?
No, it was a box set that was released with the complete
albums form. Yeah. I have all the Metal Spine CD book. The complete works like Jack Johnson and all that stuff like that. But I'm missing On the Corner, and it's going for ridiculous amounts of money. So
I love it. On the Corner is brilliant.
And then this one here, of course.
Yeah, lovely album. I mean, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, Japan, Sylvian, absolutely adored. And Raintree Crow, of course. I loved, those were one of the bands that I discovered at school. And I think, weirdly, I discovered them when I was about 14, 15. And I went to London on a trip with a friend. And they had, I think it was Quiet Life. So it had been 79 or very early 1980. And I went to London with a school friend, and it was Virgin in London. And it had Quiet Life and Manifesto, Roxy Music. And I loved Roxy Music. And I loved David Bowie. And what it said was, don't listen to this, listen to this. In effect, whoever was behind the counter was irate that Japan had a certain Roxy Music sound.
Right.
And so inevitably that pushed me to want the album now. So I heard it. And that was the first album I got, which is Quiet Life. And I thought it was great.
Oh, it's brilliant. Well, speaking of Roxy, though, I have the box set over there. What's your favorite Roxy album?
Oh, very good question. Probably still is two, actually, very different periods. For Your Pleasure, which I think is a work of genius.
Yep.
And then I think Avalon, which is a completely different album,
It is
but
just,
beautiful.
I won't say out loud what that album means because, well, okay, I will say it. If you, how do I put this tactfully? There's probably no greater album to make love to than that album. It is that amazing.
Mm.
It's just a brilliant album. And to this day, one of the most amazing shows I've seen Ferry 3 times. Once when he did the As Time Goes By, all the
Mhm.
oldies tunes. And it was right after I think Mamuna came out, which is a brilliant album. I mean, we could get off on tangents with Brian Ferry for hours, but he was so stunning. And then actually one of the last shows I've seen before the pandemic was Brian Ferry coming over in like, I think it was late 18. And he's just still just mesmerizing. That voice still
Yeah.
at 76,
He's, he's
77.
he's an amazing talent, but I still
Oh,
think that, Roxy Music was where it all came together, because that was, such a meeting of disparate creative minds.
yeah.
It was a great group.
Did you see
Ferry,
them live? Have you seen them live?
no, never seen.
I saw them once back in like, wow, 03, 04. They did like a reunion tour. It was Manzanera and it was Andy McCoy, right?
Yeah, Annie Mackay.
Mackay. And yeah, amazing stuff. So Tim, I've
He's,
kept you like
yeah, I was about to say
incredibly
Manifesto is another great album by him, very underrated. Phil Manzanera is one of the loveliest men in rock, I would say.
Oh yes,
having
you worked with him, yeah.
Yeah, lovely, lovely chap. And with Japan, Tin Drum is a very singular album. This was a band that came out of a few obvious influences, though rendered them distinctively. Bowie and Roxy in particular, but by Tin Drum, they'd created their own language, and that's an astonishing album. I
It's
think
its own album. It just
Yeah.
is, there's nothing sounds like it, and certainly it was obviously it had its effect on you and Steven creating your thing. Last thing, and I know you talked about this, so I just want to get your quick thoughts on it.
Mhm.
Is the Final Cut a top 3 or top 4 Pink Floyd album? Because I believe it's number 4 on the list.
See, I'd have to see all of the albums lined up, but it's definitely in the top 5.
Now, a lot of people say it's really Roger Waters' first solo album, and you could argue that's probably true because Rick Wright wasn't involved, and Nick Mason was only peripherally involved, and Gilmour was peripherally involved. That album, especially the first side, mind-blowingly heavy and just an amazingly stunning album. When I heard you talk about that, I forget where you were talking about on some interview. I'm like, damn, Tim and I, man, we're on the.
I think it's a fantastic. I think it was severely underrated at the time. As much as an album that sold several million can be severely underrated, it's severely underrated. But
yeah,
it's lyrically tremendous and very sensitive, and there's some powerful pieces on that.
I mean, the thing about Roger Waters is I'm not a fan of all of his work. In fact, probably some of it I could really do without. But boy, if that would have been his first album and his last solo album, it would have been amazing.
Yeah.
But a lot of people slag that album because it's not really a Pink Floyd album, but whatever, it's just brilliant. So Tim, man, I cannot thank you for nearly 4 hours of conversation. I hope I don't owe you 12 stripy jumpers, which I had to look up what the hell that even meant. I didn't even know what it meant. I'm not
12 stripy jumpers. Yeah.
It's shirts, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're going to hit me up with I owe you after we're done here, but please hang out for a minute. We're going to wrap up here. Okay. Anything you wanted to quick pimp real quick to anybody that's going to
Nothing.
watch?
I mean, at the moment, the only things I'm kind of working on, I'm working on a new solo album, which is at this moment in time 100% solo. It's me doing everything, playing everything, which is something I've never done before, and it's been really exciting so far. And it's kind of quite eclectic, quite unexpected in parts. I'm also working on stuff with Brian Hulse and David Jones. We're doing more plenty re-recording.
Awesome.
Just this week, I've recorded something with Ben Coleman, which is collaboration between the two of us, which has been
Awesome.
great fun. And there are a couple of other things that are in the pipeline.
Yeah, and there's a recent album years episode that dropped, I think, last week or the last few days, and it's a pretty grip. They're always great fun to hear you two kind of go back and forth and really get into albums. To pimp my own stuff real quick, in the description of this interview, you will find the link to the No Man deep dive that myself and Serge and Doug did. And I don't know if you watched any of it, but we really go into granular detail on every single album. There's a lot of F-bombs in that. I apologize, but it's who I am. When I use it as an expressive term. I don't use it for its phallic meaning, you know.
I have used these words.
I'm sure you have. You've done well today. I think you only used one. I think I only used three. I was incredibly good. Also, there are links to No Man's website. There's links to Tim's website. There's links to Kscope. There's, Facebook. There's Instagram. All that good stuff is down there. Last thing for me is the only thing I have scheduled right now, because I need to step back and take a little bit of a break. But tomorrow night I have a pretty intense thing going on at 8:00 tomorrow night Eastern Standard Time. Myself, Dreadful Rick, Jimmy from Future Ruins, Jake from the Upside Down Church, and Nick from Thralls of Metal. We are doing the full Catatonia discography. We're doing a deep dive on the entire studio catalog and the EPs. So strap in, boys, because that's going to be probably a 6-hour episode. So after that, I'm taking a little bit of a break from my channel. Just a couple days. We'll see how it goes. But also on the horizon, hopefully an interview with Marissa Nadler. That's coming up. So, Tim, thank you so very much. I hope you enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's true.
I know you've never participated in an interview quite like this before, I'm sure. And,
certainly not this long, anyway.
Yeah, and I do apologize for that. But again, I did warn you it was going to be pretty extensive. So hopefully, people really lock in. And I do tend to have a lot of repeaters that watch a half hour and then they come back and do another half hour. And so, please tell Steven I said hello. I think he'll know who I am. Yeah. And tell him continued success for that. And same to you. And hopefully one of these days I get to meet you if my health situation doesn't preclude that. So hang on 1 second. I'm going to end the broadcast. I just want to talk to you one moment.
Thank you.
And hang loose for just a minute. All right, guys. See ya.